Chapter 192. No one answered his question after the astounding wave of energy passed and the dust dissipated. A youth's figure slowly appeared. Ding Ning! Fu Su's disgust immediately turned to joy. He shouted in joy. Ding Ning's features were still calm. Those invisible little silkworms had disappeared into his body long ago. His presence was normal, but in Forefather Zhou's mind, he should have died long ago. Yet he was still alive and well. Just from this, Ding Ning's figure was like a true ghost, and Forefather Zhou felt terror from the bottom of his heart. With a crack, almost instinctively, a black sword light appeared in front of Forefather Zhou. Then it sped up and charged towards Ding Ning's body. While the sword light was thin, it had the power to crush ordinary realm sevens. Along the way, the shattered green crystals on the ground were lifted up. The surface was covered in black frost like a true black comet tail, filled with an ominous presence. The sword was so fast that black ice quickly formed on Ding Ning's brow, but he did not move at all. Suddenly, a dozen black whiskers reached out from under the withered leaves behind him. It was as though he had suddenly grown a dozen black tails behind him. These dozen or so black whiskers seemed to be a little afraid of the green crystal that was covered in cracks around them. Their movements were a little sluggish and cowering, but the yuan qi that was emitted from them was extremely powerful. Pew, 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 a string of cracks sounded in front of Ding Ning. More than a dozen straight lines appeared on the ground in front of him. More than a dozen earthen yellow waves of energy surged out, easily shattering the oncoming black comet tail. In the next moment, they even easily shattered the small black, cold, fiendish sword inside. Forefather Zhou's body convulsed in pain. He saw that behind the dozen black beards, a black head the size of a small hill was rising up from behind Ding Ning. That was undoubtedly the blind dragon he had seen before, the one that had been trapped here. But how could something like this happen? How is it possible? It has been starving for so many years. How can it not eat you and fight for you? Forefather Zhou couldn't help but shout. Compared to freedom, hunger is only secondary. Ding Ning thought, but he felt there was no need to explain. So he only looked coldly at Forefather Zhou and maintained his silence. Ding Ning's silence chilled Forefather Zhou's heart even more. He suddenly realized that Ding Ning's gaze was slightly familiar. He suddenly thought of the scene where he had been cut in the stomach and fled in tears. In addition, the medicinal power of the flesh bodhi that he had absorbed into his body had a reaction with his body. An immense pain rushed into his mind, causing him to howl in agony. Ding Ning moved at this moment. His body suddenly accelerated as he charged towards Fu Su. Forefather Zhou started to see illusions. He felt his body sink. The people he had once killed appeared under him. They reached out, grabbed his almost unconscious body, and pulled him into hell. Even if I am going to hell, you will accompany me. He gave a shrill scream and flew backwards. The remaining fiendish swords in his meridians all came out of his body and shot towards Ding Ning and Fu Su. With Forefather Zhou's cultivation and the condensed star fiendish energy, even if it was just one strand, not to mention Ding Ning's present cultivation, even Shui Wangshu might not be able to stop it. But looking at these fiendish swords, Ding Ning's eyes were filled with disdain. Many times, a person's fate did not depend on luck, but on their own personality and choice. In the past, Forefather Zhou had tried to force people to submit by torturing women and children. That was why he had been cut in the stomach. Today, if Forefather Zhou just wanted to flee, the blind dragon might not have chased. But now he wanted to kill Ding Ning, and the blind dragon would fight with all its power. The blind dragon needed to rely on Ding Ning to escape this cage. The top of the indigo building suddenly started to shake. This kind of shaking was because it felt the terrifying presence vibrations around the blind dragon. The blind dragon's body crashed to the ground like an enormous hammer. That tall purple Bodhi tree suddenly cracked. At the same time, pieces of earth floated up from the ground. These pieces of earth did not contain great power and did not directly attack Forefather Zhou's body. They only concealed the blind dragon's energy vibrations. At the same time, the dozen black, gem-like eyes on the blind dragon's head shot out deep yellow rays of light. These deep yellow rays of light gathered into one and swept towards the fiendish swords and Forefather Zhou's body. The beam of light and the black condensed sword collided. Suddenly, countless tiny rays of light bloomed in the air. In the next moment, the black condensed sword completely shattered, shattering into countless tiny fragments that exploded like black stars. There was a terrifying explosion. The black flames and the deep yellow rays of light wove together and formed an enormous vermilion ball of light in the air. Ding Ning had already charged to Fu Su's side. Feeling the terrifying impact in the air, he immediately frowned and used the last flower remnant sword to form a sword seal in front of him. A muffled grunt came from his mouth. That powerful impact directly crushed the power of the sword seal he had used and sent him and Fu Su flying. Bloody foam seeped out of the corner of Ding Ning's mouth, but his gaze was still extremely calm. Without Fu Su noticing, his elbow hit Fu Su's chest. Fu Su's qi and blood had been vibrating nonstop, and his eyes were filled with golden light. When Ding Ning collided with him, he felt his chest tighten and immediately lost consciousness and fainted. Ding Ning coughed softly and grabbed the unconscious Fu Su to fall to the ground. A low roar of anger sounded in the air. Sensing that Ding Ning was wounded again, the blind dragon was furious. The deep yellow rays of light shooting out of its body landed on the ground. More than a dozen straight lines appeared on the ground and stretched towards the retreating Forefather Zhou. Forefather Zhou's cultivation was strong, but his energy sea was almost frozen. The slow release of vital energy was his greatest weakness right now. Facing these terrifying, slashing essences, he did not have the time to gather power to deal with them. A dozen cracks immediately appeared on the surface of his body. These dozen or so powerful forces cut deeply into his body. Forefather Zhou heard the cracking sounds coming from his body. He sensed that many of his organs and vital blood vessels had been cut. He sank into greater pain. Yet in the next moment, he found that he had not died. He sensed something. The despair and unwillingness in his heart disappeared. He looked down in shock at his body. The cracks in his body shone with a mesmerizing purple light. The cracks made him think of fresh purplish-red radishes. Some strange and slightly bright liquid flowed out, but it was not the blood he was familiar with. Already? His gaze instinctively turned to his left hand. Then he saw half of the flesh Bodhi connected to his left hand had withered. Just half of it had already caused such a change in his body. His consciousness sank into his body. He sensed that his energy sea had collapsed under the blind dragon's attack, but the vital energy in his energy sea was no longer frozen. Pew, 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 with just a thought, countless vital essence, and the collapsed heaven and earth yuan qi gushed out of the cracks in his body, and even his body was thrown high into the air by the recoil. Under the attack of these vital energy and primal energies of the universe, the cracks in his body seemed to grow larger. Yet, a mad smile appeared on his face. He felt a sense of smoothness and power he had not felt in a long time. These cracks in his body seemed to be new energy channels that his body had opened. One step into hell, one step into immortality. Forefather Zhou laughed maniacally as his gaze landed on Ding Ning. Who would have thought such a thing would happen? Since I am not dead, then the one to die is you. He looked at Ding Ning and said. Ding Ning looked up. A hint of strangeness appeared on his calm face. Then he gave a low shout to the blind dragon beside him and attacked again. Fine flowers bloomed on the last flower remnant sword. In the next moment, the sword turned into countless threads and created countless fine paths. The blind dragon reacted. Its fleshy feelers danced again. Waves of energy flooded out of its body and into those paths. All of the seal scripts on the interior walls of the indigo building suddenly shone with blinding light. Countless indigo bolts of lightning immediately covered the ceiling and started to flow. Forefather Zhou, who had survived the calamity and whose body had undergone astounding changes, was at his proudest moment. Yet when he saw such terrifying lightning and saw that his body was illuminated indigo by the indigo lightning, his eyes filled with terror and he screamed again. No, there was a loud rumble. The indigo lightning fell like a curtain. Ding Ning frowned deeply as he flew in front of the blind dragon. The pillars of indigo lightning were less than a foot in front of him. No lightning fell from the side where he and the blind dragon were. The two sides formed completely different worlds. Multiple pieces of debris flew out of the lightning. One of them had an alluring purple color. It was the half-withered flesh Bodhi. At the same time, the runes in the entire green building also emitted cracking sounds, and countless dust fell down like snow. The blind dragon, almost out of power, sensed something and suddenly looked up. A piece of indigo rock fell down. Then a second piece, a third piece. The roof of the indigo building collapsed and revealed large swaths of the sky. You can also die. Yet at this time, an unusually shrill howl came from the lightning. Forefather Zhou charged out of it. His body was damaged to an unimaginable degree. His limbs were broken, and his body was riddled with holes by the lightning bolts. Yet he was not dead yet. He seemed to have strength of unknown origin. As he howled, his damaged body and half an arm stabbed towards Ding Ning's chest. Chapter 193. The remaining half of Forefather Zhou's arm moved with the sword. The last bit of vital energy in Forefather Zhou's body shot out from between his broken meridians and bones. It cut through the surrounding air and created ripples of whirlpools. His power was not even a tenth of his usual power, but it was still far above Realm 3. The blind dragon sensed the presence of Forefather Zhou's attack. It sensed the true and warm sunlight falling from the top of the shattered blue cage, and hesitated. In this situation, it felt that if it helped Ding Ning stop Forefather Zhou, it would be seriously injured. The cage was broken. If it was seriously injured, it may not be able to leave this place. However, just as it hesitated, Ding Ning took a step forward with a bang and arrived in front of it. His calm eyes suddenly shone brightly. Countless silkworm-like sounds rang out from his body. Countless strands of fresh aura seeped out from his flesh and blood at an unimaginable speed. They gathered in his meridians and rushed to every part of his body. His flesh, bones, the marrow river deep in his bones, and even his hair started to tremble inexplicably and gave off a strange and powerful presence. The blind dragon sensed Ding Ning's figure in front of it. It immediately felt ashamed. In the next moment, it sensed the presence emanating from Ding Ning's body and felt deep reverence. Forefather Zhou heard the soft sounds coming from Ding Ning's body. His remnant body suddenly shook. He thought of a possibility and inhaled strangely. But the sword move could not be changed now. His remaining arm was less than 10 feet from Ding Ning. An unimaginable majesty suddenly appeared on Ding Ning's face. His left hand formed a sword seal and first swung forward slightly, creating several vital energy waves in the limited space. Almost at the same time, the last flower remnant sword in his right hand stabbed forward. The sword energy from the sword passed through the vital energy waves from his left hand. The waves of sword energy started to spin and quickly absorbed the primal energies of the universe in the surroundings. Pure, white lotus flowers formed in the space several feet in front of Ding Ning. This was an unimaginable scene. The pure, white lotus flowers gave off a holy presence, and gave off a soft light as though they did not compete with the world. They were perfect compared to these lotus flowers. Forefather Zhou, whose body was damaged and only used his severed arm as a sword, looked like a demon that had crawled out of hell. Seeing this lotus flower, Forefather Zhou, who was like a devil, seemed to see a ghost. There was a muffled sound. The lotus flowers in front of Ding Ning scattered. He shouted softly, his left hand gripping the sword hilt. His entire body vibrated like a string being plucked, but he did not take a step back. The sound of silkworms biting in his body grew louder. Pale white flames appeared on his skin. Those invisible little silkworms seemed to become tangible and scrambled out of his body. Forefather Zhou had already looked like he had seen a ghost. When he saw this scene, his eyes filled with absolute terror. Ding Ning gave a muffled grunt. Blood seeped out of his mouth again, but the vibrating last flower remnant sword in his hand was swung forward without rest. The hard blade appeared extremely soft at this moment. The sword lights wrapped around Forefather Zhou's severed arm like strips of cloth. Forefather Zhou's energy had been released from his severed arm to fight against Ding Ning's sword lights. Yet these seemingly soft sword lights were like strange millstones that ground away the powerful energy. Millstone, Forefather Zhou screamed. Extreme terror caused him to lose control of any power in his body. His body trembled violently as he fell to the ground. Ding Ning's hands trembled weakly as he gripped the sword hilt. Yet he knew he could not show any weakness. He took a deep breath. His dignified features gave off even sharper murderousness. His sword left Forefather Zhou's severed arm. Staring at Forefather Zhou's face that was just inches away, he used all his power to stab towards Forefather Zhou's neck. While the flesh Bodhi was something of legend to him, and Forefather Zhou's survival in this situation surpassed his understanding. But a person's mobility could not leave the range of their body. If he cut off the spine and cut off the head, he did not believe Forefather Zhou could continue to live. Crack! The cold sword cut into Forefather Zhou's neck with an ear-piercing sound of friction. But Ding Ning's wrist twisted, and he was unable to cut off all of Forefather Zhou's neck. The sword was stuck. "Your bones are really hard," Ding Ning sneered. He put more strength into his hands, and the sword cut through Forefather Zhou's spine like a saw. Forefather Zhou's body suddenly convulsed. He wanted to grab the sword that was deeply embedded in his neck, but he had no hands at this time. His body twisted in pain on the ground, like a worm that had been nailed to the ground. 9-death silkworm. Forefather Zhou gave up, struggling after a few breaths. He looked dazedly at Ding Ning's face and squeezed out 3 words. Ding Ning sensed that all of the power in Forefather Zhou's body had truly dissipated. He coughed softly and relaxed slightly, but he still used the sword to cut Forefather Zhou's bones and did not respond. "You are actually his successor?" Forefather Zhou murmured to himself. He left behind an heir? Ding Ning remained silent. With a crack, Forefather Zhou's spine was finally cut. Ding Ning's last flower remnant sword started to cut the last bit of flesh from his neck. Looking at Ding Ning's cold gaze, the moment his head was cut off, Forefather Zhou thought of the authoritative presence that flowed from Ding Ning just now, and the multiple different sword essences just now. He suddenly found something was wrong. Even if you are his heir, you cannot know Zheng Xiu's pure white lotus. An even greater shock suddenly surged through his body. This shock was even greater than the impending death. "You are right." Ding Ning spoke and put away his sword. Forefather Zhou's voice was cut off. His head rolled forward along the uneven ground. Forefather Zhou, who should have died before the Yuanwu emperor ascended the throne, finally died. Ding Ning coughed softly and coughed up some blood clots. He sat down dejectedly. Looking at Forefather Zhou's corpse, he did not feel much joy. Even if this was an enemy, the death of this person meant that another person from that era had disappeared. You can leave. Ding Ning tiredly turned his head and looked at the blind dragon. He pointed at Forefather Zhou's corpse and then started to gesture. The formation here has been destroyed. You can leave. But before you leave, help me take care of his corpse. Also, there are some people outside the valley that you cannot defeat, but your perception should be stronger than theirs. So if you are careful, you should have no problem running away. Many powerful cultivators will come to the Wu Mountains soon. Try to hide if you can. Otherwise, I do not know what will happen to you. The slightly cowering blind dragon slowly understood some of his meaning. It remained motionless for a few dozen breaths. Then the long whiskers on its head started to sway. A powerful force caused Forefather Zhou's body to split apart and then sink into the earth below. His body started to sink into the earth below. Finally, the earth churned and he disappeared from Ding Ning's sight. With a boom, a corner of the distant blue building's wall quickly collapsed. A wave of dust slowly floated over from the distance. The surroundings became completely silent. On the surrounding ground, only the unconscious Fu Su and the half-withered flesh Bodhi were left. Ding Ning adjusted his breathing. Resisting his exhaustion, he stood up and sat down next to the flesh Bodhi. His fingers slightly touched this flesh Bodhi, and a few invisible little silkworms gushed out from between his fingers and palms, tentatively devouring some of the energy. His brow immediately furrowed deeply. The nature of this energy was very strange. Even his 9-death silkworm could not decompose it. If he truly refined this energy, if it flowed into his body would unavoidably undergo the same changes as Forefather Zhou. He would become a spirit body, like a moving tree, and naturally cut off countless possibilities for future cultivation. This flesh Bodhi was of no use to him. But after a moment of thought, he still reached out and grasped this flesh Bodhi. The heart-shaking sound of thousands of silkworms eating sounded again. The flesh Bodhi rapidly withered between his fingers, turning into gray sand and scattering. The energy of the flesh Bodhi that the countless little silkworms in his body had swallowed did not enter his body at all. It disappeared as the invisible little silkworms hid. The king of Chu was still waiting patiently. Suddenly, his brow furrowed slightly, while gusts of wind swept out of the mist in front of him. Like a leaking raft, the primal energies of the universe that the formation carried started to disappear. The formation disappeared, and the mist dissipated. Chapter 194. Mo Shouqing's eyes shone with an unusual light. He was the wisest old man in Changling. He knew that Forefather Zhou did not have the power to destroy a formation like this. Then the change at this moment was an accident. The mist dissipated faster and faster. It didn't just scatter upwards, and in all directions, the moisture even seeped into the ground below. As the moist water vapor disappeared, some of the grand sun primordial fire accumulated in the valley was completely released as the magic formation was destroyed. All the messy branches and vegetation started to burn fiercely. The entire mountain valley was filled with golden flames, like sunflowers blooming. A green building appeared in their line of sight in the middle of the burning valley. The king of Chu's brow furrowed even deeper. He had entered this formation before Forefather Zhou, and this blue building, compared to Mo Shouqing and Pan Rui, the beauty in palace attire, he had a deeper understanding of everything inside. Why would a cage like this be destroyed? At this moment, he did not even pay attention to the flesh Bodhi and pondered this question with all his heart. In just a few breaths of time, the golden flames disappeared, leaving only ashes in the valley. The foundations of the green buildings were burned red, and as the heat rose, the cold mountain wind rushed in. A strong wind blew in the valley, and countless ashes were swept into the sky. As it cooled down, the blue building gave off an ear-piercing sound of collapsing from bottom to top. Cracks spread from the bottom to the top like vines. The entire pagoda-shaped green building was about to completely collapse. It was also at this time that two figures that were incomparably thin compared to the green building walked out from one of the arched doors, supporting each other. Pan Rui's eyes immediately lit up. She should be happy now. Yet for some reason, she did not feel any joy. Maybe it was because she knew that, according to the normal result, these two people should have died. A faint smile appeared at the corners of Emo Shoching's mouth. This is fate. He turned to look at the King of Chu and said seriously and emotionally, "Now and in the future, we have won the gamble." There was still no anger in the King of Chu's eyes. He stared at Ding Ning and Fu Su as though countless stars were flashing in his eyes. He sensed the presence of Ding Ning and Fu Su and thought back to the scene of the blue building. A strange expression appeared at the corner of his mouth. This is impossible. He seemed to be replying to Emo Shoching, but also seemed to be talking to himself as he shook his head and spoke. However, the impossible has become possible. Then he smiled again. If the absolute impossible becomes possible, then there must be a possibility. I thought of a possibility. He turned with a smile and looked at Emo Shoching. He said, "Victory and defeat are not decided in one moment." Emo Shoching frowned slightly. He did not understand the meaning of the Emperor of Chu's garrulous words, but the other was not too dispirited and depressed after decades of waiting and planning had turned into a dream. This was something he found hard to understand, and even felt uneasy. "Where is forefather Zhou?" The King of Chu asked gently, not looking at him. He turned to look at Ding Ning and Fu Su. He was one of the longest reigning emperors in the world. While he spoke calmly, he had an unimaginable dignity. Ding Ning coughed softly. His wounds were not light. The mountain wind that blew against him made him uncomfortable. The burning ground made him uncomfortable. And the dust that filled his nose made him uncomfortable. But all of these discomforts added together were not as strong as the discomfort the three people in front of him gave him. No matter if it was the long-reigning King of Chu, the teacher of the Holy Son of the Qin dynasty, Emo Shoching, or Pan Rui, the master of the cultivation sect Weiyang Palace that the Empress had raised, he knew them all. The change in expression in the King of Chu's eyes caused him to feel cold. "You do not need to answer." Emo Shoching's voice sounded at this time. There was absolute confidence in his eyes. While he could not kill the King of Chu, or even stop the King of Chu from leaving, he was certain that he and Pan Rui could take Ding Ning and Fu Su away. Ding Ning bowed his head and maintained his silence. The King of Chu's expression completely calmed. He did not speak and walked forward with his hands behind his back. Pan Rui immediately became nervous. The King of Chu was walking towards Ding Ning and Fu Su. "Monarch, are you joking?" Understanding what she was nervous about, the King of Chu, walking with his hands behind his back, said softly in disdain. He appeared to be walking slowly, but in a flash he passed by Ding Ning and Fu Su and walked towards the ruined Indigo building. Emo Shoching's eyebrows rose slightly. Many silver dots of light suddenly lit up high above his head. The Emperor of Chu's body also slowly released a faint but powerful aura. He did not turn back and continued to walk. A faint layer of purple light appeared in the air around him. The silver dots of light in the sky grew brighter like dozens of silver stars, were floating there. But the King of Chu's expression was still unusually calm. When he walked to the center of the ruins of the Indigo Building, where the flesh Bodhi should have been, a crimson Buddhist bead appeared in his hand. His brow furrowed slightly as though he was in slight pain. The crimson Buddhist bead suddenly disappeared from his hand. At the same time, a vast and terrifying presence spread from his palm. The faint purple light in the air around him suddenly became incomparably bright, and a huge purple lotus platform as big as a mountain appeared in everyone's line of sight. Without any sound, all the broken pieces of the green building instantly turned into extremely fine dust spreading outwards. The enormous indigo wave of dust rose dozens of meters high like a real tide and spread towards the entire mountain valley. Pan Rui shouted in shock and anger. A small snowy white sword flashed out in front of her and landed between the dust wave, Ding Ning and Fu Su. Yet what caused her to pale was that the dust wave did not have much power. However, when it came into contact with the sword light emitted by her small sword, the huge wave of dust exploded to both sides. "Do not worry, the King of Chu has left." Mo Shoqing turned around and said softly to her. At the same time, his body seemed to give off invisible threads, and the star-like light in the sky quickly disappeared. Pan Rui was silent. The small snowy white sword circled around Ding Ning and Fu Su before flying back to her, and disappearing like it had melted. The clear sword energy formed a tornado that sucked in all the dust around Ding Ning and Fu Su. Ding Ning took a deep breath. The unusually fresh air in the surroundings did not make it difficult for him to breathe, but the uncomfortable feeling in his body did not decrease and grew stronger. He turned around and looked at the center of the spreading indigo wave of dust. When the King of Chu had left, the power that had destroyed all the remnants of the Indigo Building had been astounding. All the dust had spread out from the center, so the center was the first to become clear. Ding Ning narrowed his eyes. He saw that all the traces had disappeared. Where the enormous Indigo Building had been, it had caved in like a crater created by a meteor. Mo Shoqing calmly watched as the dust dissipated. He thought for a long time and then looked at Ding Ning and Fu Su. He asked the same question as the King of Chu had just now. "Where is forefather Zhou?" Fu Su was slightly shocked at this scene and also felt joy at surviving a calamity. But more than that, he was dazed. He instinctively shook his head and looked at Ding Ning. "Killed by the blind dragon." Ding Ning slowly answered, "There is a blind dragon inside." Mo Shoqing looked at him and continued to ask, "Other than the blind dragon?" "There is also the flesh Bodhi." Fu Su answered first. "Forefather Zhou refined the flesh Bodhi, but was still killed by the blind dragon." Ding Ning continued. Mo Shoqing looked gently at him and said, "The blind dragon was able to kill forefather Zhou, but why did it not kill you? Why was the formation here destroyed?" "That blind dragon was very hungry." Ding Ning's uncomfortable feeling grew so strong that his body started to tremble. But he still said in a calm tone, "This building is an enormous cage to it. I told it that I may be able to help it obtain freedom." Hearing these words, Mo Shoqing frowned. Even Pan Rui said in disbelief, "How is it possible? How can a hungry blind dragon listen to you?" "Because I comprehended some secrets of the formation inside and activated some seal scripts of the formation." Ding Ning coughed softly and looked at her. He said, "It chose to believe me." Mo Shoqing looked at him and asked, "I want to know the details of forefather Zhou's death." Ding Ning took a deep breath and slowly exhaled. Then he shook his head and said, "I do not know. Before forefather Zhou was killed, Gongzi Su and I were knocked unconscious by his power. So the battle between him and the blind dragon caused the formation to be destroyed." Mo Shoqing turned around and looked at the enormous pit. "You are just guessing. You did not see forefather Zhou's death with your own eyes. Then why did the king of Chu destroy everything here to hide?" Ding Ning grew silent. He did not answer. He did not know how to answer. There were many suspicious points in this place to anyone, especially when he was facing the wisest old man in Chongling. "Eat this pill medicine." Pan Rui's left hand moved slightly. Two milky white pills floated in front of Ding Ning and Fu Su. Maybe he did not want us to see any seal scripts in the ruins, and did not want us to detect the traces of the blind dragon's escape, she said with a cold expression. Mo Shoqing nodded and said, "Maybe." Chapter 195. The Milky White Pill was the precious spirit lotus pill, the noblest mistress of the Chongling Imperial Palace. Other than possessing an unknown method of manipulating star energy, also had a unique method of nurturing spirit lotuses. In order for the spirit lotuses to produce the lotus seeds, she needed the spirit energy of countless spirit veins in Chongling had been channeled into the Chongling Imperial Palace. While the spirit lotus pill was made from the leaves and petals shed during the growth of the spirit lotuses, the effects were astounding. When Ding Ning took this spirit lotus pill, he felt threads of cool, medicinal power seep into his meridians. In an instant, the pain and dryness in his body disappeared. However, the discomfort in his heart grew stronger because he knew that Mo Shoqing had a thread of suspicion about him. Mo Shoqing possessed extraordinary status in Chongling. Even if someone like him did not enter the formation like the king of Chu, and had no clues to deduce, even if his suspicions were like the white clouds floating in the sky without any foundation, such suspicions were enough to cast a shadow over Ding Ning. From a certain point of view, Mo Shoqing's suspicions about him meant that the noblest mistress of the Chongling Imperial Palace would also have some suspicions about him. This was enough to decide his fate in Chongling. Compared to Mo Shoqing, he had to worry more about the king of Chu. What had the king of Chu detected? What would he do next? A simple matter of using the power of the imperial palace to deal with forefather Zhou had involved so many unpredictable and uncontrollable consequences. Ding Ning felt a wave of bitterness in his throat. The so-called fate of the heavens could never be decided by one person. Mo Shoqing's gaze moved away from the deep pit in front of him and landed peacefully on Ding Ning and Fu Su. In reality, his attitude was not as serious as Ding Ning thought. While this matter was suspicious, he did not connect it to the 9-death silkworm. Also, after Xue Wangshu's battle with Liang Lian, he had a good impression of Ding Ning. He had some understanding of Ding Ning. He also knew that Ding Ning had astounding cultivation talent and comprehension ability. Even though Ding Ning had purposely concealed something, in the end, he had allowed Fu Su to live on. He had prevented the king of Chu from obtaining the flesh bodhi, prevented Ding Ning from being killed. While the Deer Mountain Conference had not officially started, in his mind, as a cultivator of the Qin dynasty, Ding Ning had made the greatest contribution in this unprecedented event. He knew that Ding Ning had been preparing for the Min Mountain Sword trials. In his view, just this astounding contribution was enough to recommend Ding Ning to enter Min Mountain Sword sect to cultivate. So he looked calmly at Ding Ning and Fu Su with a hint of undisguised satisfaction. "You left Chongling with forefather Zhou because you wanted to see how the Deer Mountain Conference was like. Now, that forefather Zhou is dead. I will take you to Deer Mountain." He did not say anything superfluous and only said kindly, "The formation was destroyed, and the mist in the valley was emptied. The moisture in the mountain peak became even thicker because of this. On this side of the goddess peak, a heavy rain began to fall. Interesting." The king of Chu, whose face was covered in age spots and whose wrinkles seemed to have deepened, looked up at the clouds and rain. He smiled slightly and murmured softly to himself. He was not in a hurry to return to Deer Mountain and headed towards the Goddess Peak. Decades of waiting had come to nothing. He had not obtained the flesh Bodhi. Before the Deer Mountain Conference officially started, he had nothing to do, so he was very free. His mood was very relaxed right now. As one of the longest reigning monarchs in the world, he naturally had extraordinary aspects that ordinary people could not reach. He had spent his entire life fighting against some of the strongest people in the world. Of course, he knew that man planned, and the heavens dished. The cultivator who had set up the formation under the Goddess Peak was much stronger than him. He had spent a great deal of effort to build a cage to trap the blind dragon. Of course, he wanted the blind dragon to help protect the immature flesh Bodhi until he or his descendants could use it one day. But clearly, the cultivator who had set up the formation and the sect behind him had disappeared in the river of history. In his view, it was normal that he had not obtained the flesh Bodhi. Also, compared to the flesh Bodhi, he felt that he had obtained something more interesting. Putting aside the blind dragon, there is only one person in the world who can defeat the legendary blue lightning sky ultimate formation. No matter how talented a person is, they cannot have that kind of insight. After saying the words "interesting," his body floated up into the air and landed on a cliff at the mountainside of the Goddess Peak. He then sat down. He plucked some wild tea leaves from the rocks and then used his vital energy to make a stone pot. He lit a burst of true fire and then plucked a patch of clear water from the mist in front of him to boil tea like an immortal. The king of Chu smiled contentedly and murmured softly to himself, "Such a good rain." A light rain suddenly fell on the peak of Deer Mountain. In the temporary Chu Palace, a cultivator with a white jade-like longsword at his waist sensed that this drizzle seemed to contain an unusual meaning. He raised his head warily. In the drizzle, he did not see anything other than the drizzle. But at this time, his heart suddenly tightened. In the next moment, his heart felt like it was being squeezed by an invisible hand, and it was being forcefully crushed. With a poof, a mouthful of blood surged out of his mouth. This cultivator of the Chu dynasty did not even have the chance to scream before he fell down and died. An old bamboo hat appeared in the rain. Then a slightly stooped gray figure appeared like a ghost under the bamboo hat. Cold wind, bitter rain, green vines, and chaos. Taoist Ku, you did not come to Deer Mountain earlier or later, but came at this time. I do not understand your intentions. Consort Zhao looked calmly at the gray figure in front of the door, shook her head, and said, while she spoke calmly, her eyes were as gentle as autumn waters, and her actions were indescribably enchanting and seductive. The person under the bamboo hat grimaced. He slowly raised his head and revealed a plain face that looked to be in his 50s. We came from so far away for the matter of the crown prince. The man, who looked to be in his 50s and had a slightly stooped body, slowly said, "We wish to make the fifth prince the crown prince." Consort Zhao smiled brightly and said, "But the emperor has already made the crown prince." The man she called Taoist Ku, you said silently, "If Li Lingjun dies, another crown prince can be made. The Deer Mountain Conference is near. What the Chu dynasty needs the most right now is stability." Consort Zhao looked at him and said softly, "I do not understand why someone like you is determined to do something like this." After a pause, Consort Zhao looked at him and said, "Theoretically, you would not care if the fifth prince or Li Lingjun became the crown prince." The man she called Taoist Ku, you was silent for a moment and said, "I do not need to tell you the reason." Consort Zhao frowned slightly and said, "You cannot kill him. I did not come alone. Chu Chifeng also came. So Fan Wugo will not appear here." Taoist Ku, you looked at her and said seriously, When he walked into the palace, Consort Zhao had first said, "Bitter wind, bitter rain, green vines in chaos." This was not a poem describing the scene in front of him, but representing the 4 cultivators of the Chu dynasty. You were once the 4 strongest cultivators of the Chu dynasty, but you know that in these years, the Chu dynasty has produced grandmasters like Fan Wugo, who can match you. Consort Zhao could sense his absolute confidence, but she was not nervous at all. She smiled and said slowly, "Also, you should know that even in the past, when you were said to be the strongest, it was because many people had not shown their full strength and excluded some people from the imperial palace. So you still can't kill Li Lingjun today." She paused and then said seriously, "No matter what someone said to you to have you come here, this matter cannot succeed. So you should give up on such thoughts. His Majesty is not here." Taoist Kuyu shook his head and said resolutely, this represented his final decision. The King of Chu was not here, so he believed he could kill anyone here. So when he said this, his body seemed to suddenly fade in the air. Countless strange, faint, and seemingly traceless but unusually tenacious and powerful presences came out of his body. Like a spring rain, they seeped into Consort Zhao's body. These powers flooded towards Consort Zhao's heart. Consort Zhao's heart stopped beating and started to contract violently. "You are wrong." But Consort Zhao's expression did not change at all. She looked pitifully at Taoist Kuyu and said softly. Then she started to move, taking a step towards Taoist Kuyu. Taoist Kuyu's breathing and heartbeat suddenly stopped. In this moment, in his mind, Consort Zhao's heart seemed to become the hardest object in the world. The power he had seeped into Consort Zhao's body was unable to match her power. There was a loud boom. A huge boom resounded in the empty palace. A white fist, carrying a terrifying wave of energy, expanded at an astonishing speed in Taoist Kuyu's eyes. Taoist Ku, you let out a low growl, and all the power in his body surged out. 2 small, light green swords floated out from his hands and slashed at the white fist. Crack! However, in the next moment, the 2 small light green swords turned into 2 shooting stars and flew backwards to an unknown place. The bones in his arms were completely shattered, and the bones in his chest were also completely shattered. Boom! His body flew back dozens of feet and smashed into the ground. Consort Zhao gently pulled back her fist. Her fist looked very tender and soft, but in the last breath, it had turned into one of the most terrifying weapons in the world. Taoist Ku, you continuously coughed up blood. He was so shocked he could not speak. "Now you should understand why I said you were wrong." Consort Zhao looked at him, her long eyelashes trembling. She said with slightly pursed lips, "Now you should understand why the emperor has favored me the most in these years, and why he is willing to put the future of the Chu dynasty in my hands. Because," she looked at her fist and said slowly, "because my hand can be soft, but it can also be hard, because I am the strongest person in the Chu other than him." Chapter 196. Bleak Wind, Bitter Rain, and Vines. Heavenly Works Pavilions Chu Chiefing, Humble Schools Taoist Kuyu, Whitestone Workshops Du Qingting, and Bamboo Mountain Workshops Zhou Yunwan. These 4 had once been the strongest grandmasters of the Chu dynasty and could even represent an era. But today, Taoist Kuyu, one of the 4 grandmasters, had been instantly defeated by demon Consort Zhao, who was rumored to only know how to charm people. He had been defeated so easily that even the palace was not damaged. The scene looked even worse than a battle between low-level cultivators. As one of the 2 sides, Taoist Kuyu naturally knew better than anyone the difference in power between himself and Consort Zhao. Consort Zhao's punch had not just destroyed his body, but also his Tao heart. How is this possible? So when he heard Consort Zhao Xiang's words, he said in a daze, In the past many years, the strongest cultivators in the world have never come from the Chu dynasty. Being good at using material things is the difference between people and animals. But relying too much on material things is the greatest weakness of your generation of cultivators. Consort Zhao looked coolly at him and said softly, "Using things to benefit oneself is the true path of cultivation. While this is simple, and any cultivator of the Chu dynasty understands, compared to the cultivators of the Qin and Zhao dynasties, you seem to lack energy from the start of your cultivation." If this was any other time, Taoist Ku, you would have snorted at Consort Zhao's words and said that Consort Zhao was speaking nonsense. But after seeing the other's crushing punch, he had a completely different understanding. He grimaced. Is this what they mean by understanding the truth, but being unable to do it? Consort Zhao smiled brightly and said, "Since you have seen my cultivation today, you should have some confidence in the future of the Chu dynasty and me." Taoist Ku, you shook his head and said softly, "I still do not have confidence." Consort Zhao Xiang's expression suddenly changed. A rare coldness appeared on her face. She said harshly, "For a long time in the future, the Chu will not have someone stronger than me. You do not have confidence in me. Is it because of the people from outside the court? You are from Chu. Why would you listen to the opinions of people from other dynasties?" Taoist Bitter Rain took a deep breath. This was his last breath in this world, so the air he breathed into his chest and abdomen was exceptionally sweet. Consort Zhao's face turned even uglier. She could see that Taoist Kuyu was seeking death, but even she could not stop a cultivator of this level from killing her. There was a soft explosion in Taoist Kuyu's heart, and then this grandmaster of the Chu dynasty dropped his head and died. Consort Zhao clenched her fists tightly, then slowly released them. A beam of essence qi appeared in the air above her head, rising into the sky like a smoke signal. Who is it that can make people like you and Chu Chiefing believe that it was wrong for our emperor to make Li Lingjun the crown prince? I can even send you to your death." She couldn't control her emotions as she looked at Taoist Kuyu's corpse. She really couldn't understand. The night gradually passed, and the morning mist dissipated. A faint light silently flew down from the clouds. Endless Palace was the name of a palace in the inner palace of Chongling. It was also a secret cultivation place the Empress had set up. The Empress came from the Bazin Kendo ground. She had been a legendary cultivator during the wars against the Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties. The cultivation place she set up naturally had astounding methods rarely seen in ordinary cultivation places. Pan, Rui's fish-like steed, was also extraordinary. At least, it had never appeared in the records of any cultivation records. Even with the addition of Ding Ning and Fu Su, this fish-like steed still flew very lightly. It did not show any fatigue after flying for a long time. High up in the air, Mo Shoqing's body naturally released a presence to offset the cold wind. There was not much difference between being high up in the air and when he landed, but when the steed landed, Mo Shoqing seemed to feel something heavy land in his body. He finally made up his mind and turned to look at Ding Ning. He said softly and guiltily, "I must apologize to you. From the start, I purposefully concealed my identity." Ding Ning was silent. He thought if he had to apologize, he should be the first to apologize. He thought that he could have easily used the Empress' power to deal with forefather Zhou. But because of the King of Chu's appearance, things became so complicated, and he and Fu Su were in true danger. "I know you must be very angry." Fu Su looked at Ding Ning's silence and grew nervous. After saying this, he didn't know what to say and froze where he stood. Ding Ning looked up at his nervous features and said, "You do not have to apologize because I never asked for your identity." Fu Su stilled. He did not understand the meaning of the words. Ding Ning said calmly, "I never look at the other's identity, when making friends. Fu Su reacted. He looked joyfully at Ding Ning and said, "You really do not care?" Ding Ning frowned slightly and said, "As long as you do not care." Fu Su understood Ding Ning's meaning and nodded hard, just like before. Hearing the two youths' conversation, Mo Shouqing smiled slightly. In his view, this was a very childish conversation. How could the children of the imperial family, especially the future crown prince of the Qin dynasty, have true friends in the future? The wind was cold when the mountain was high. People who stood too high would not have friends. This was unavoidable. At this time, Deer Mountain was clearly visible. Looking at Deer Mountain that was not particularly outstanding among the surrounding mountains, Fu Su, who was in a good mood, could not help but turn respectfully to ask Mo Shouqing, "Principal Mo, what do we do next?" Mo Shouqing was the teacher of the Holy Son of Heaven and also the principal of the main school that taught the members of the imperial family. But in these years, other than the Yuanwu Emperor, the Empress, and Huang Jinwei, not many people in the outside world could see him. So he found the title of Principal Mo refreshing. In fact, this form of address made him feel younger and reminded him of many of the past. He smiled in pleasure and said benevolently, "Next, we are going to climb the mountain, but not Deer Mountain." Fu Su stilled. He could not understand Mo Shouqing's meaning at all. Even if they were going to climb other mountains, why did they have to land at the foot of the mountains? Why couldn't they just fly up? Mo Shouqing looked at Ding Ning and said gently, "That day, when you and Shui Wangshu walked into my sight, I have some understanding of you. From the start, you were valued by Wang Taishu because of your astounding judgment. Can you guess what Palace Master Pan and I want to do?" Ding Ning thought for a moment and did not waste words. He said, "The Holy One is coming to Deer Mountain in person. Other people do not need to consider the matters of Deer Mountain. We just need to ensure that we are not influenced by outside powers." A hint of emotion appeared in Mo Shouqing's eyes. He said slowly, "When the four emperors meet at Deer Mountain will be sealed off by the armies and cultivators of the dynasties. At that time, the closest distance to the peak of Deer Mountain will come from the peaks of these mountains." Fu Su seemed to understand and said in shock, "You mean even if the conference starts, people may fly over the peaks?" "This is a conference without any past events. Anything is possible." Mo Shouqing looked at him and said, "But true experts only need the right time. They do not need to fly over. They just need to have their power appear at the peak of Deer Mountain at the right time and at the conference." Fu Su completely understood and said, "So around Deer Mountain, any mountain close to the peak of Deer Mountain will be taken by astounding experts. You need to choose a mountain that can be climbed. There are so many grandmasters in the world. Who dares to feel they are invincible? Also, Palace Master Pan, and I have not reached Realm 8. Even if we work together against the King of Chu, we do not have an absolute chance of victory. How can we guarantee that we can climb any mountain we want?" Mo Shouqing nodded. His gaze landed on the silent mountains in the dawn. "Naturally, we can only find a mountain that can be climbed. The morning light was faint, and the dew on the grass gave off a glowing light." Mo Shouqing and Pan Rui slowly walked to the foot of a mountain. There was no change in presence, but all the dew on the grass at the foot of the mountain fell down at the same time. Even though each drop of dew was extremely small, it wouldn't make any sound even if countless of these drops of dew were to drip to the ground. However, when all the dewdrops fell at the same time, it brought about an unimaginable aura. With a swoosh sound in the air, an invisible tide formed in the mountain forest, so grand that it was simply unimaginable. After the previous questions, Fu Su knew that there were likely great grandmasters in these calm peaks, but when he sensed such a level, his face still lost color and grew paler. Ding Ning narrowed his eyes slightly. He was certain that this mountain was not one that Mo Shoching and Pan Rui could fight over. He knew that Mo Shoching and Pan Rui wanted to use a small price to guarantee that they would be able to fight at full power during the Deer Mountain Conference. The moment he had this thought, Mo Shoching and Pan Rui stopped in front of him and walked towards another mountain. Chapter 197. The second peak they reached was on the east side of Deer Mountain. Before they reached the foot of the mountain, Mo Shoching, who had been walking at the front, stopped when he saw the full appearance of the mountain from a distance. "Principal Mo, we cannot ascend this mountain." Thousands of drops of dew fell at the same time, turning into an unimaginable tide. The great presence formed by the accumulation of countless minute presences still reverberated through Fu Su's body. He looked at Mo Shoching, who had stopped walking, took a deep breath, and tried to calm himself down. Then he said softly in puzzlement, "Just now, I truly understand why I have to stay far away from these mountains. If these mountains are filled with grandmasters like this, then if I fall from the top of these mountains, I will be targeted by everyone. If they see my identity, I fear they will work together to kill me. But what I do not understand is that this mountain looks very calm, and there does not seem to be any presence at such a distance. Why can't we ascend it? Could it be that the Grand Master on that mountain has already revealed his realm from such a long distance away?" Mo Shoching had turned around by now. Hearing Fu Su's words, the old man shook his head and said, "If one can display a presence that causes even me to retreat from such a distance, then one must be a realm-mate, but one does not have to display the same level as the previous person." Fu Su knew that this principal of the main compound was most skilled at causing people to think and have their own comprehension. Yet he still could not understand. "Look at the peach blossoms on the mountain." Ding Ning reminded him softly. Fu Su's eyes widened, his body shook slightly, and he finally reacted. There were some scattered wild peach trees on the mountain. Along the way, the wild peach trees in the Wu Mountain area had not bloomed, but now all the wild peach trees on the mountain had bloomed. Even from afar, one could see that the flowers on the wild peach trees were exceptionally bright. It was a common red color, but the red color was so thick that it seemed like jade juice was about to drip down. The mountain flowers are in full bloom, so thick. Is the person on this mountain right now the legendary young Marquis Li of the Qi dynasty? He said in shock. There were many people in the world who used the title of young Marquis to imply that they did not care about fame and fortune. However, most of the time, it was because it was impossible for them to obtain the title of a noble. However, Li Mingzong was a true Li Mingzong because he was a true member of the royal family of the Great Qi dynasty. He was a prince of the Great Qi dynasty who was born with a fief. Strictly speaking, the current emperor of the Great Qi dynasty, Qi Mingzong, had to respectfully call him imperial uncle. But ever since he started to cultivate, this cultivator, who was born as a marquis, became a wild crane that did not belong to any cultivation place in the Qi dynasty. In the Qi dynasty, where spirits and ghosts were the main cultivation methods, he was a true anomaly in the cultivation path. What he cultivated was the pure way of nature, the method of life bond items. In the many legends of the past, he had fought with many grand masters of the Qi dynasty, but he had never been defeated even once. Other than young Marquis Li, no one else in the world can make flowers bloom brighter than life. Mo Shoching said admiringly, "The new peaches this year will be unprecedentedly delicious." Fu Su said in disbelief, "I heard that young Marquis Li is very strong, but Principal Mo, you and Palace Master Pan have to avoid him." Mo Shoching said calmly, "His life bond item is the heavenly nurturing bead. He does not have strong killing intent, but it is the best life-preserving talisman. After so many years of cultivation, I do not know how much his energies have grown. When he fights, his vital energy is endless. Before the Deer Mountain Conference, no one can afford to waste time with him. Even if they could win, they could not afford to waste time. This time, Fu Su truly understood that in a situation like the Deer Mountain Conference, the fights between these grandmasters were not as simple as a blade and a sword as usual. The heavenly nurturing bead that nurtured all things in the world. The one on this mountain was naturally young Marquis Li. Thousands of dewdrops turned into an indescribable and terrifying tide. The one on the previous mountain was naturally Song Chaosheng, a cultivator of the extinct Song family of the Wei dynasty. Song Chaosheng. Young Marquis Li, what other names would appear that represented the greatest power in the world? Ding Ning followed Mo Shoqing and Pan Rui to the third mountain as such a thought flashed through his mind. Even for him, he only knew the names and power of these people from rumors, and had never seen them up close. This mountain still cannot be climbed. I had not thought that even an old monster like Guodongjiang would come. When they reached the foot of the third mountain, Mo Shoqing's expression showed a rare hint of seriousness as he slowly said to Pan Rui beside him. Pan Rui usually stayed in the inner palace for a long time and did not smile. Hearing his words, she immediately frowned and said coldly, "He is not dead." Ding Ning's expression was calm, but he was slightly shocked inside. Fu Su had never heard of this name before. Seeing this, he could not help but ask softly, "Principal Mo, I still do not feel anything unusual. Who is this Guodongjiang?" The greatest abnormality here is that there is no abnormality at all. Mo Shoqing looked at Fu Su as he said this. He knew that Fu Su would not understand. As he turned to walk towards another mountain, he explained gently, "This mountain does not have any presence left behind by cultivators, and there are no traces of battle, not even the presence of cultivators who passed by. It is like a restaurant table that should have passed by many diners and would have left some soup behind. But now, it is extremely clean. This can only mean that someone used a cloth to wipe it away. The only person who can wipe away all presence is the Grand Master of Blue Jade Island, Guodongjiang. In the past, the Qin dynasty opened up an overseas trade route and wanted to interact with this Grand Master. But this person was very strange and did not want to interact with the outside world. Even more importantly, this person injured his head in his early years. He is slightly older than me, so he often has brain problems and is temperamental. He does not have common sense." Fu Su realized and said softly, "Madman?" Mo Shoqing frowned and said, "Even more importantly, he is a madman just a step away from realmate. Do not drink with drunkards, do not fight with madmen." This was a principle that everyone in Chongling knew. Hearing this, Fu Su understood that he had to keep a respectful distance from this mountain. But he could not compete for even several mountains. He could not help but feel dark clouds. Was there someone he could not compete for on every mountain? Mo Shoqing and Pan Rui were the highest people in Chongling. If even these two people were unable to compete for the top of any mountain here, then how many unknown and shocking experts would there be in the various dynasties under the heavens? "Careful!" Pan Rui suddenly shouted in a low voice. Mo Shoqing had been the first to stop on the previous mountains, but at the foot of this mountain, Fu Su and Mo Shoqing stopped at the same time. When Pan Rui shouted, Fu Su saw a layer of white mist suddenly appear in the forest ahead of him. The white mist was formed by the white hairs on the stems and leaves of an unknown wildflower. Each strand of hair was softer than snow, but this white mist carried a terrifying murderousness. As she shouted, Pan Rui's right hand flicked like she was plucking invisible strings. The sound of many sharp objects rubbing against each other suddenly sounded in the air in front of her, Ding-Ning and the others. The fine hairs did not seem to have any connection to them. They were forced aside by a powerful force and passed over their heads. Ding-Ning's eyes flashed. He immediately sensed that the primal energies of the universe in the surroundings were partially concealed by some unique method. What method is this? Fu Su also sensed this abnormality. While he could not get close to the white hairs, his breathing unconsciously became uneven. Mo Shouqing seemed to relax. He nodded and said, "We can compete for this mountain." Pan Rui continued to walk unhurriedly. Her fingers were still flicking slightly. The sounds of sharp objects rubbing against each other were still dense in the air. Dozens of feet away from Ding-Ning and the others, a thin curtain of light flashed like a crystal ball and covered Ding-Ning and the others. Wisps of yuan qi constantly flashed across the light screen. They seemed like lightning, but they were not lightning at the same time. Fu Su was even more shocked. The white mist formed by the white hairs quickly disappeared. But even with his cultivation, he could clearly sense that there seemed to be a pair of invisible hands covering the entire peak of this mountain. The higher they went, the more the primal energies of the universe were blocked. Some of the unblocked vital energy instead formed true killing intent after a simple vibration, carrying out a true attack on the cultivators walking on this mountain peak. Chapter 198. The sky was dim. Halfway up the mountain, not just the primal energies of the universe, even the light was covered and twisted by an invisible power. Pan Rui's expression grew colder. Threads of powerful vital energy and primal energies of the universe came out of her body. While she could not bring in large amounts of primal energies from outside the mountain, her body was like an empty mountain that contained countless primal energies of the universe. Fallen leaves danced. The fight between primal energies of the universe only made soft sounds, but the tearing of true power caused the leaves of all the trees in Ding-Ning and Fu Su's sight to leave their branches and dance wildly. The tumbling leaves weaved into curtains that covered the world in front of them. Why bother? A light voice came from somewhere on the mountain peak. It passed through the layers of green curtains and reached the ears of Ding-Ning and the others. The Tao Scroll and Flowing Cloud. The strongest of the Tao Scroll sect is the Flowing Cloud essence. I want to see it today. They were both true grandmasters, the top people of the world. Even their presence seemed to be fully displayed under the others' pressure. The moment Pan Rui raised her head to speak, a clear energy spread from her body and stabbed into the sky above her head. Then she reached out a hand towards the mountain peak. With a snap, there was a sudden explosion in the sky above her head. A beautiful ray of sunlight shone down from the azure sky, illuminating her body. Her entire body was dyed a faint gold. As the sunlight fell, primal energies of the universe burst out like a dam. The surging primal energies of the universe flooded in through the only gap, turning into a visible blue wave. It was also at this moment that a pure white sword flew out from her hand. The blue wave surged into her small white sword. The small white sword immediately disappeared. A straight path of light was left behind among the layers of green curtains. At the peak of this mountain, under an ancient pine tree, a man in indigo robes was sitting. This green-robed man's face was no more than 30 years old, but his pair of black eyes that were as calm as an ancient well seemed to contain the contents of mountains and seas, containing the meaning of the accumulation of time. When the straight path of light appeared in the countless layers of green leaf curtains, he raised his eyebrows slightly. He used his index and middle fingers as a sword and pierced forward. When his fingers stabbed out, The air in front of him seemed to become extremely viscous. An object appeared, spinning at high speed and unstoppable. It was Pan Rui's small white sword. The two fingers of this grandmaster in green robes became absolutely transparent. Even his blood vessels and bones seemed to have completely disappeared. They only emitted a sparkling luster. They had reached the top of the mountain. On the plains outside Deer Mountain, an enormous procession slowly appeared. This procession had more than 5,000 people, but from the top of the mountain, it was possible to see that only half of the 5,000 people were soldiers, and the other half were officials and ceremonial guards. The golden dragon patterns on the bright yellow flags and canopies were minuscule from a great distance, but they still had astounding presence and seemed to break through the air. As a result, this procession was a patch of golden light, as blinding as the sun at this time. In the world, only the Son of Heaven could have such a lineup when he went on an inspection tour. After the king of Chu ascended Deer Mountain, the second emperor finally arrived. You are right. The second to ascend Deer Mountain is the Yen dynasty. Looking at this golden procession, Pan Rui, who seemed to have become ethereal and was absorbing the primal energies of the universe from far away, glanced at Emo Shoching and sneered. How did you guess that the second to ascend would be the Yen dynasty? Dingning spoke up and asked. The Yen dynasty is not below the Chu dynasty in power, but the Yen emperor is the most cautious and does not appear in front of others. So in his many years on the throne, he is very conservative, Emo Shoching answered patiently. Ding Ning asked, then the emperor of the Qi dynasty? Emo Shoching smiled faintly and said, the emperor of the Qi dynasty is the most shameless. In terms of shamelessness, no one in the world can match him. But this is his strength. Fu Su became curious. He could not help but want to ask what the other dynasties thought of his father. But when he thought that asking such a question would be disrespectful to his father, he smiled self-deprecatingly and gave up on the thought. His minute movements could not escape Emo Shoching's eyes. Emo Shoching glanced at Ding Ning, who had calmed down, and was silent. He thought geniuses born in the marketplace had seen more and matured earlier. There was no need to ask such a question. If they did not feel that the Yuanwu emperor and empress were truly heartless and wanted to conquer the world, why would the other three dynasties think of the Qin dynasty as their greatest enemy? Chapter 199. When the Yen emperor's carriage arrived at Deer Mountain, the cultivators of the Chu and Yen dynasties did not show their cultivation, but just the enmity in their hearts, and the clash of presences caused the sky above Deer Mountain to change color. The clouds twisted and turned into all kinds of strange shapes. The auroras that only formed in the polar regions flashed in the air and caused the sky above Deer Mountain to be exceptionally colorful. That kind of murderousness did not give people any sense of beauty. They just felt that some great beast would come out of the clouds at any time. Yet, not long after the Yen emperor's carriage arrived at Deer Mountain, another long procession appeared on the vast plains to the east of Deer Mountain. They were still very far from Deer Mountain. Maybe they would arrive before nightfall. But soon, waves of bone-corroding cold wind blew over. A long black cloud suddenly appeared in the sky around Deer Mountain. This black cloud appeared unusually dark among all the colors. It swayed, but was not affected by the other flames. From this phenomenon, Ding Ning knew that the emperor of the Qi dynasty, known as the Ghost Emperor, had come. An indescribable feeling appeared at the corners of Ding Ning's mouth. Seeing the top experts of the world at once, this kind of event seemed to be a good thing for the Yuanwu emperor. Among the Qi emperor's carriages, the imperial items were all bright yellow and the decorations were mostly made of jade. But among them, there was an unusually large and black palanquin. Carrying this large palanquin were 8 large men in chainmail. Through the cracks in the chainmail, the skin of these men gave off an eerie white color. They did not give off any heat and were unusually cold. At this time, the interior of this large palanquin was like a unique world. Jade was used as bricks to make the interior look like a hall. The ceiling was inlaid with pearls that gave off dots of cold light. There were 2 purple-black wooden chairs in the center that gave off a strange smell of oil. One of the people sitting on them was dressed in dragon robes and an imperial crown. His face was white and beardless. He looked to be in his 40s. While his face was slightly long, he gave off an indescribable nobility. Naturally, this was the Qi Emperor. The other person was dressed in a pitch-black robe and wore a white bone necklace on his wrist. His pitch-black hair was also tied up with a white bone ring. Although he was a man, his face was more beautiful than most women in the world. Teacher Ruo, this time, the lives of the Qi dynasty's people are in your hands. You are. The Qi Emperor's expression towards this handsome man in black robes was extremely respectful. If someone saw him right now, they would suspect that the handsome man in black robes was the real Qi Emperor. It is all right to speak to other people, but there is no need to be so shameless in front of me. The handsome man in black robes did not seem to think of him as an emperor at all. He interrupted him with slight displeasure. Since I have had you build such a dark palanquin, I naturally do not cherish my life after coming to Deer Mountain. I have never thought of returning alive. What else do you have to worry about? Being directly exposed by this black-robed handsome man and being called shameless. Emperor Qi laughed embarrassedly. He was not angry but said even more respectfully, "If you don't like to hear these words, I won't say them. But if there's anything else you want me to do, please let me know." The handsome man in black robes shook his head and said, "No need. You just have to remember what you promised me. After I die, deliver my body to my disciple." The Qi Emperor said awkwardly, "How can I definitely die?" The handsome man in black robes frowned and said, "You were afraid that I would not die earlier, and now you say such things. Do you not find it boring and shameless?" The Qi Emperor shook his head and sighed. "I cannot look down on the world like Yuanwu and the others. A mediocre person like me, if I do not even know how to say such heartwarming words, then I really am useless." The handsome man in black robes looked at him for a moment and said sincerely, "You are too humble." The night was coming. The Qi Emperor's carriage finally arrived at the foot of Deer Mountain. The 3 emperors had arrived and were only waiting for the Qin Emperor. Boom! The armored warship that had traveled through the Wu Mountains and the turbulent waters finally reached the shore. There was an enormous roar like thunder, and also like the world was groaning in pain. White waves rose like snow between the ship and the rocks on the shore. The Yuanwu Emperor stepped out and was the first to land on the shore. Many drops of water fell on his dragon robe and landed in the eyes of the dragon. The dragon's eyes immediately lit up as though it had come alive. The Yuanwu Emperor raised his head. In the bloody storm 3 years before his ascension, the Qin dynasty had been greatly weakened. The following battle against the Chu had been a great loss. So, starting 3 years after Yuanwu, he and the entire Qin dynasty had been enduring and conserving their strength. At this time, he was like a sword that had been sheathed for many years being unsheathed. The Yuanwu Emperor moved. He didn't use any carriages. He just walked at the front. In the battles many years ago, he and the many powerful cultivators that had followed him had always been the first to charge at the front of the battle formation. But now, no one could stand shoulder to shoulder with him. Wind blew everywhere, for huge clouds swept across the sky, forming 4 huge pillars of clouds that supported the heavens and the earth. Countless stars flashed in the center of these 4 pillars of cloud. It was like he had plucked a piece of the sky and embedded it in the center of these 4 pillars of cloud. The mountains around Deer Mountain were silent. Suddenly, many people in the mountains sensed something and turned to look in the direction of Wu Mountain. The flowing light above Deer Mountain was attracted by an indescribable power and flowed in the direction of Wu Mountain. It formed countless lines of light in the sky that stretched for many miles. In everyone's sight, the 4 enormous cloud pillars and the flashing stars slowly appeared. All of the light fell into the stars and returned to one. But the 4 enormous cloud pillars and the stars did not move and calmly accepted everything. The mountains around Deer Mountain were filled with the strongest grandmasters in the world. But when they saw this scene, they were shocked. For them, this was still a grand state that was hard to describe and incomprehensible. The aura of a few people reacted because their minds were too shaken. With a boom, a crimson-red energy suddenly surged out of the mountain that had been sealed by the sword mark and charged into the sky. The crimson-red light lit up the entire mountain like an enormous torch. At the same time, an unimaginably majestic stream of water vapor rushed out from the mountain that Guodongjiang occupied. In an instant, it formed a huge blue water dragon that rushed straight into the sky. Its body seemed to be solid as it passed through the clouds. Half a breath later, a mountain appeared with purple light like thousands of orchids blooming at the same time. These auras were all profound and grand to the extreme. However, if anyone were to judge them, they couldn't compare to the 4 cloud pillars and the starry sky. Ding Ning frowned deeply as he looked at the 4 cloud pillars and the sky approaching. His eyes flashed like stars in the night. The Yuanwu Emperor's cultivation was higher than he had expected. In the main hall of the palace at the peak of Deer Mountain, the old king of Chu held consort Zhao Xiang's hand and sighed emotionally. After so long, in the Qin dynasty, in the world, there is finally a second grandmaster who has reached this level. The equally old Mo Shoqing looked at the 4 cloud pillars and the sky, his eyes filled with emotion. Only people like him truly knew what kind of price one had to pay to become an emperor for all eternity. It should be enough. He turned and said softly to Pan Rui. Pan Rui nodded. The vital energy that she had not recovered much surged out of her body. A white light stabbed into the sky above the mountain like a sword. Ding Ning's brow furrowed deeply again. This kind of power could only be used to mark or let people know her use on this mountain. What were she and Mo Shoqing waiting for? Chapter 200. As the 4 cloud pillars came closer to the foot of Deer Mountain, Ding Ning's frown deepened. Under the cover of these 4 cloud pillars, the Qin dynasty troops could not see them clearly in the darkness. The Yuanwu Emperor did not walk quickly. His entire body was in a strange energy. It did not seem like his body was moving, but invisible primal energies of the universe were pushing him forward. He walked on an invisible path in the world. His walking seemed to be pulling on an invisible seal. Every person in the Qin dynasty army behind him felt their footsteps lighten. They even felt threads of primal energies of the universe that they usually could not feel seeping into their bodies. The surface of their skin gave off layers of faint golden light. In the past, when he had killed Bai Shanshui and Zhao Yi, he had only used limited power and used the Empress to attack. But at that time, only the top cultivators of Chongling had sensed his cultivation. Ever since he ascended the throne, he had endured and gone into seclusion for this Deer Mountain conference. Now that he had truly shown his cultivation, everyone in the Qin dynasty army felt even more awe. But what puzzled them was that the bureau chief of the clan law bureau, Huang Jinwei, who had been following behind the Yuanwu Emperor and was just a person's length away from the Yuanwu Emperor, did not change at all. Huang Junwei's entire body seemed to be separated from this invisible talisman, and there was no change compared to usual. The ordinary cultivators in the Qin dynasty army, and even Marquis Su, who was as heavy as a mountain, did not understand. For this procession, the Qin dynasty Yuanwu Emperor was walking at the front, but there were vanguard troops and ceremonial officials who had come ahead of him. Along the way, they had made arrangements with the other 3 dynasties and set up their own defense zones and camps. Along the way, some troops and cultivators had set up camp. The closer they got to the foot of Deer Mountain, the fewer people following behind the Yuanwu Emperor. An indigo figure suddenly appeared in front of the Yuanwu Emperor's path. Even though the people following the Yuanwu Emperor were the best of the Qin dynasty, and even if the Yuanwu Emperor did not act, no grandmaster could match the elite forces of a dynasty gathered here. But when they saw this indigo figure appear, most of the people behind the Yuanwu Emperor grew nervous. General Feng has worked hard. The Yuanwu Emperor did not stop and said in praise. The indigo figure bowed deeply and said, "Greetings, Holy One." All the nervous people immediately relaxed. They were slightly shocked. The mighty General Feng, who had been guarding the pass, had been transferred over. "Follow this lonely." The Yuanwu Emperor walked past Feng Xiang and said gently, dressed in indigo robes. Feng Xiang stilled slightly. He was not used to the Yuanwu Emperor calling himself this lonely, but he immediately nodded in agreement and followed silently. What is important? The Yuanwu Emperor did not look back. His gaze was fixed forward. But after Feng Xiang started to walk, he suddenly asked. Feng Xiang frowned slightly. He looked up at the back of this powerful emperor and said, "The world is important." The Yuanwu Emperor showed a satisfied expression. "This lonely is very satisfied with your answer. You have worked hard outside the pass. After this conference, you can return to Chongling to rest." He said directly. Then he paused and slowly said, "As long as this lonely one is here, I can guarantee your Feng family's safety and wealth." Such a promise from the emperor's golden mouth was an unimaginable reward for any prestigious family. But Feng Xiang's expression was still calm. He was calm because he knew what kind of price he had to pay. He also knew what kind of deeper meaning he would have after making such a promise. "Thank you, Holy One, for your kindness." He bowed slightly in thanks. "Interesting." The Yuanwu Emperor said coolly. He did not say this to Feng Xiang, but to an ordinary pine tree on the side of the path. The moment he spoke, the air was slightly distorted. A layer of soft blackness, darker than the night, spread out on a branch of the pine tree. The blackness seemed to form the shape of a curled-up infant. But when the Yuanwu Emperor's gaze landed on it, the blackness quickly dissipated. Huang Jinwei and Feng Xiang exchanged a look and saw the seriousness in each other's eyes. At this time, on the peak of Deer Mountain, in a newly built and majestic tent, a wisp of black flames suddenly surged out of the fingers of the black-robed, handsome man in the black palanquin parked at the north. It jumped in the air like a candle before being extinguished. "Interesting." Emperor Qi looked at him anxiously, but he shook his head and said, after pondering for a while, looking at the 4 clouds, Ding-Ning took a deep breath. His furrowed brows relaxed. Then he closed his eyes, leaned against the trunk of a withered tree, and started to rest. He was still too far from the Yuanwu Emperor and Deer Mountain. His cultivation was too lacking, so at this time he could not see all the clashes on Deer Mountain. There was no meaning in watching now. Only when the conference truly started, when the experts attacked with all their power, could he see clearly the moves of these people who might interact with him in the future. A stone step appeared in front of the Yuanwu Emperor. This was the first step on the path to Deer Mountain that faced him. Only when he stepped on this step could he truly begin to ascend Deer Mountain. The 4 emperors had gathered. Tomorrow would be the true start of the Deer Mountain Conference. Yet, the moment he stepped onto the stairs, Emperor Yuanwu's lips curled into a strong and confident smile. For him, the true conference had begun. In the distant plains, the black clouds roiled, the wind howled, and light scattered. The powerful primal energies of the universe caused by the terrifying presences spread through the plains. Even the grandmasters on the mountains around Deer Mountain could not sense it from a great distance. But as the only realm 8, Emperor Yuanwu could faintly sense the abnormality in the world. In the pitch-black plains, a wolf came from the distant meadow. It was the leader of the wolf pack. It was exceptionally strong and had an exceptionally sensitive sense of smell. It smelled the scent of countless fresh blood, and there seemed to be a kind of indescribable, wonderful taste condensed in it. It made it feel that, as long as it could devour this kind of flesh, there would definitely be great benefits. But when it burrowed out of the long grass and saw the scene in front of it, this usually bloodthirsty and violent wolf curled up on the ground in terror and started to tremble. Tens of thousands of people, horses, and carriages appearing in one place at the same time, especially in the midst of a chaotic battle, was a terrifying matter. Also, there were countless cultivators here. The brightest flashes in the sky were not the lightning in the storm or the meteor shower, but the trajectories of many seal weapons and rare flying swords that gathered primal energies of the universe. At the center of the battlefield whirlpool formed by tens of thousands of people, wild winds, snowstorms, rain of fire, thick fog, they appeared and mixed together. Even the ground seemed to have turned into many different small worlds that underwent different changes. Realm 3 and 4 swordsmen could be seen everywhere. The terrifying explosions and shockwaves created by sword attacks became insignificant existences at this time. Due to the extreme speed of the flying swords, the sky above the centermost area of the battlefield was almost completely covered by a dense net of sword light. The speed at which the flying swords reaped lives was naturally astonishing as well. In the suffocating air, who knew how many streaks of blood would splatter out in every breath of time? But even these powerful cultivators who controlled flying swords were not much different from ordinary soldiers in a battle like this. The primal energies of the universe were controlled by countless thoughts and were extremely chaotic. A flying sword that had been flying well could lose control in the next moment without any warning due to encountering a turbulent flow. Even the cultivators who had been controlling their flying swords could encounter multiple swordsmen charging at them, or even dozens of seal chariots. For any experienced general, they could know at a glance that this was the end of a great battle. All of the formations and commands that had been used at the start of the battle were no longer effective. Chapter 201. The sword the cultivator in moon-white robes held was also moon-white. After his vital energy flowed into the body of the sword, the primal energies of the universe gathered into a thin, glowing light that flowed on the surface of the sword. This sword looked light, but it was unusually tough and sharp. The 2 cultivators above the 5th realm that he had killed had been cut in half along with the weapons in their hands. The general, who stood silently like a part of the abandoned chariot, was extremely patient. He waited until the light on the moon-white sword dimmed before he suddenly moved. A muffled sound suddenly came from under his feet, as if a giant hammer had struck something wrapped in cotton. Such a sound was not noticeable in the battle formation, where even the wolves in the distance were trembling. But in the next moment, this indigo-armored general became the focus of everyone's eyes. 2 rows of waves of energy spread to the sides as his body advanced. The surging power caused all the soldiers in his path to flip to the sides. His indigo armor had originally looked unpatterned in the night, but now It was covered in dense black gold seal scripts. Scorching hot air collided with these seal scripts, causing golden sparks to fly. Sensing the presence coming from this general's body, the swordsman in moon-white robes paled. This was his weakest moment, but from a certain point of view, this was the strongest moment of his life. Because the enemy was unprecedentedly strong, he had to use all of his power, including his last life-saving measure. A pure white crystal with the unique presence of a life-bond item floated in front of him. Pure white flames flowed into the long sword in his hand. At the same time, the rumbling sound of a giant mountain moving came from the sky. Many flying swords in the sky whined in terror and dodged. Uncontrollable cries of shock rang out one after another, while they saw this swordsman in moon-white robes kill people like grass, and even casually kill Realm 5 experts. This person had been hiding himself. Only now did the crowd realize this person was a true Realm 7 Grandmaster. At this time, the indigo-armored general was in front of him. There was a sharp cracking sound. A blinding purple flame came out of the general's hand. Boom! A muffled drum beat sounded in the world. However, this muffled sound drowned out most of the sounds on the battlefield at this moment, causing everyone's hearts to violently jump. The figure of the swordsman in moon-white robes disappeared. When the surrounding people recovered, they found this Realm 7 swordsman's body had turned into a flowing white light in the night, and he had been sent flying back countless feet. The indigo-armored general stood motionlessly at his spot. His figure appeared to be incomparably tall because the green armor on his body began to crack. Those runes that flickered with golden light seemed to have absorbed the force of the clash just now, but the result was that the green armor itself began to crack, blown away by the roiling true essence on his body. Inside the shattered green armor was a middle-aged man with a thin figure. His right hand gripped a purple object that looked like a short stick. His face was haggard and melancholy, but he had unspeakable determination. General Fan. In such a long and chaotic battle, even a Realm 7 expert was powerless. The other people were naturally even more tired. Yet the moment this middle-aged man appeared, countless cheers and shouts sounded. Many people seemed to gain strength and courage, and even the confidence to win. In a battle like this, in this world, only one general with the surname Fan could give his soldiers such confidence. The Chu dynasty, the victorious General Fan Donglu. One side was the Chu army, and the other side was mostly dressed in black robes and armor. Most of the cultivators were swordsmen. This was the army of the Qin dynasty. Hearing the joyful shouts and cheers, it was possible to conclude that this was the original general of the Chu army, and most people did not know that Fan Donglu was here. Seeing the Grand Master in moon-white robes being sent flying by a blow, several nearby swordsmen dressed in light armor or cloth robes had sorrowful expressions and leapt towards Fan Donglu. Fan Donglu's expression was normal. The purple object in his right hand gave off a gem-like light, and a unique energy entered his body. But his right hand remained motionless. His left hand used his fingers as a sword, shooting out purple sword lights and easily killing these swordsmen. He was one of the few experts of the Chu dynasty, and his strength far surpassed Realm 7 Grandmasters of the same level. He had not moved in the previous battle because he wanted to play a decisive role now. Once he killed these swordsmen, his body flew up and headed north. With a speed faster than most flying swords, he landed on a large and heavy chariot. This chariot was shaped like a square cauldron. It was different from ordinary chariots, and there were strange metal nets around it to prevent the attacks of seal weapons. There was an old man sitting alone in the middle of the chariot. This old man did not use a sword, but each time his presence vibrated, a part of the ground on the battlefield would roil, and the Chu cultivators on it would immediately disappear. In Fan Donglio's eyes, this old man was the most threatening person on the battlefield right now. The other had Realm 7 cultivation, and this old man's every attack seemed to be controlling the situation of the entire battlefield. Each of his attacks was accumulating victory for the Qin army. Fan Donglu could not think of a general like this in the Qin dynasty other than those he was familiar with. However, he was certain that as long as he could kill this old man, this battle would end with their victory. The Grand Master in moon-white robes was Gongyang Ningyi from the Luo Shin Sword School. He was the only person who could pose a fatal threat to him on his way to assassinate this old man. At this time, he had used a dozen cultivators and a piece of golden armor to deal with this threat. In his view, no one else could interfere with his fight with this old man. However, at this moment, Fan Donglu suddenly felt an unusual aura. He raised his head in disbelief and looked at the endless sky above him. In the endless sky, several white streams of light suddenly appeared. These streaks of white light were not the brilliance of flying swords, but real flames. Above the boundless sky, white sparks fell from the sky. In this moment, Fan Donglu thought of many stories. In the past, sparks like this had appeared many times on the battlefields between the Qin dynasty and the Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties. Many famous generals had died in such sparks. This represented one of the strongest inheritances of the Bazin Kendo ground. But the legendary female cultivator, who had used this power many times, had completely changed her identity. Admirable. Fan Donglu had an indescribable bitterness at the corners of his mouth. He immediately guessed the identity of the old man. The disbelief in his eyes quickly turned to emotion. He murmured softly to himself, "I had not expected even you to leave Chongling and come here. Then isn't Chongling an empty city now?" Dear Mountain, the sky was about to brighten. There were only a few stone steps left in front of the Yuanwu Emperor. From the time the armored warship had docked at the shoal closest to Deer Mountain, walking all the way here to now climbing the mountain, he had used a night. In his perception, he could no longer feel the unusual vibrations from the distant plains. He knew that the dust of that great battle had settled. A confident smile appeared at the corners of his mouth again. Coincidentally, at this time, in the sky that was about to turn white, a thin meteor streaked across. "A general star has fallen. Good luck." This type of astrology would naturally be judged and recorded by historians. However, he had already made his judgment and said this to Huang Xinwei behind him. In his view, the history books of the future would be decided by him. Chapter 202. The morning wind at the peak of Deer Mountain was slightly cold. The etiquette officials of the 4 dynasties had prepared for many years for the conference and had practiced many times. The 4 dynasties stood side by side, like 4 tigers chasing a deer. Naturally, they all had their enmity, but these etiquette officials appeared to be close and coordinated. They did not even speak loudly. In the imperial camp of the Qi dynasty, the handsome man in black robes walked out of the black sedan. He looked at the flags, golden battle axes, stars, squats, standing gourds, my staff, imperial staff, and other things as they appeared. Closest to the throne were horsetail whisks, golden cauldrons, incense boxes, wash bowls, spittle bowls, golden bottles of various sizes, and other miscellaneous items. What this kind of alliance meeting needs the most is a martial arts stage, but they just have to make it so complicated. How hypocritical! A cold judgment came from his mouth and landed in the ears of the Qi Emperor next to him. The Qi Emperor smiled, almost wretchedly, and said, "This is not hypocrisy. The more complicated the etiquette, the more solemn it will feel. At least, it will remind us that ruling the world is not a child's play. It will make us more careful in our words and decisions. The handsome man in black robes frowned slightly. After a moment of thought, he said, "Reasonable." The Qi emperor looked at the handsome man in black robes, who seemed to understand, and was slightly happy. Then he immediately became worried. He said, "Of the Qin people who came to Deer Mountain with Yuan Wu, 2 important people are missing." The handsome man in black robes glanced at him and did not seem very interested. The Qi emperor continued, "Li Si and Hu Hai also left Chongling with the Yuan Wu emperor, but they are not at Deer Mountain. You do not have to worry about anything." The handsome man in black robes turned to look at the Yan dynasty's camp and said coolly, "Victory is not here. Even if you have to take the lead, it will not be your turn." The Qi emperor was shocked. He looked in incomprehension at the handsome man in black robes. He saw where the handsome man was looking, and his eyes widened in disbelief. "Is it enough?" the black-robed handsome man coldly shouted, interrupting his words. The drums and flutes sounded, and purple smoke rose. In the tent of the great Yan dynasty, a man walked out of a steaming bathtub. Countless water droplets rolled down from his silky smooth skin like dewdrops rolling on grass. The 2 palace maids were both worldly characters. Han Chuanshui's face was like congealed cream, and white jasmine was like a soft veil. Their faces were incomparably beautiful. At this time, seeing this man walk out of the bathtub naked, looking at his perfect figure without a trace of fat, the 2 palace maids couldn't help but blush. However, there was not much shyness in their eyes, only a strange respect. The man did not hesitate in the slightest. Under the service of the 2 palace maids, he put on a clean gauze robe and nodded slightly to express his thanks. "Thank you, teacher." A general in golden armor was already waiting outside the tent. When he saw the man walk out, he immediately bowed and led the way. A crown was placed in front of them, and the 4 emperors began to take their seats. This man followed closely behind Emperor Yan. The Yuan Wu emperor's gaze met the gaze of the other 3 emperors. In the spring of the 12th year of Yuan Wu, the Deer Mountain Conference officially started at the peak of Deer Mountain. The 4 emperors were the highest existences in the world. They did not bow to each other. Their own ceremonial officials had already paid respects to the world, ghosts, and gods. The 4 emperors each had a personal attendant. Sitting next to the Yuan Wu emperor was Huang Jinwei. Sitting next to the emperor of Chu was not Consort Zhao, but the new crown prince, Li Lingjun. Sitting next to the emperor of Yan was the man who had just bathed. Sitting next to the emperor of Qi was naturally the handsome man in black robes. All the ceremonies were finished. The scene was silent, other than the 4 emperors and their 4 attendants. Everyone present had grave expressions as they waited for the emperor of Chu to speak. In the great battle in the 3rd year of Yuan Wu, the emperor of Chu and his Chu dynasty had won against the Qin dynasty and caused the Qin dynasty to sign an agreement with the Chu, Qi, and Yan dynasties. No matter how old he appeared, he was still the host of this conference. The most important content of the agreement was the ownership of Yangshan Commandery, the spoils of war of the Chu dynasty. I need 3 years. Before this, everyone had been guessing what the emperor of Chu would say and what he would do. Yet, without any opening, the emperor of Chu directly revealed the answer. He looked calmly at the Yuan Wu emperor and said, "Retreat needs time." The emperor of Qi frowned slightly, but thinking of the words of the handsome man in black robes, he pressed his lips together and did not speak. Returning Yangshan Commandery was naturally the best guarantee to avoid war, but to ask for a buffer of 3 years without any additional conditions, this concession seemed to be too great. The Yuan Wu emperor nodded slightly. The Emperor of Yen, who had been the most cautious in Mo Shouqing's judgment, frowned slightly and was about to speak. Everyone felt that the Yuanwu Emperor would immediately agree. No need for 3 years. Yet the Yuanwu Emperor refused. Before he could say no, the Emperor of Yen sensed something was wrong and suddenly looked up. Yangshan Commandery has returned to the Qin dynasty. The Yuanwu Emperor calmly continued to speak. His voice rumbled into everyone's ears like thunder. With the 4 emperors gathered, no one else had to consider any major matters. So the cultivators of the dynasties were all at peace. When Emperor Yuanwu spoke, the entire Deer Mountain trembled and countless murderous energies attacked. All the dewdrops on the grass that had yet to disappear were shaken off and scattered in the air, then twisted into fine mist by the chaotic aura. Li Lingjuan's face was snowy white. His hands clenched and trembled slightly. The ownership of Yangshan Commandery was the most important matter of the Deer Mountain Conference. Yet no one had expected the Yuanwu Emperor to attack Yangshan Commandery before the conference. Only news had reached Deer Mountain at this time. This meant that the battle had happened last night. The Emperor of Chu frowned slightly. His face was covered in age spots and wrinkles. With this frown, he appeared to have aged slightly. Yet his expression was still calm. He said slowly, "In the past, the agreement was not to attack each other. You have violated the agreement." When the Emperor of Chu said this, the clouds above Deer Mountain danced with more killing intent. The Yuanwu Emperor shook his head and said, "Yangshan Commandery is borrowed, not given." The past agreement stated this, and the agreement only agreed not to invade the borders of the other dynasties. This Yangshan Commandery belongs to the Qin dynasty. If we send troops in, we will not cross the Chu borders. How can we violate the agreement? This was a literary skill. For anyone, this was an argument. Yet everyone knew that Yangshan Commandery's return to the Qin dynasty was an established fact. What shocked the people of Chu dynasty the most was that Chu dynasty had so many soldiers in Yangshan Commandery. How could the Qin army take down Yangshan Commandery at such a rapid speed? Marvelous! A new voice sounded. It was only 2 words, but everyone present was shocked. Only the Qi Emperor's eyes flashed with light. He knew that the black-robed man's words had become the truth. The one who had spoken was the Yen Emperor, who was sitting in an exceptionally proper and cautious posture. Taking back Yangshan Commandery while the experts are gathered here, such a plan is marvelous. Yet, even if you can find some loopholes in the agreement, we have come here in person to discuss the ownership of Yangshan Commandery. You are making a joke of us by doing this first. Everyone present knew that the Yen Emperor was the most cautious. Even if he had an opposing opinion, he would be the last to speak. No one had expected him to be the first to speak. As he spoke, even many people from the Yen dynasty were shocked. The Yuanwu Emperor's expression did not change. He said, "This is not a joke. I am just resolving a problem first." Problem? Just a word of trouble. And how many people have been beheaded? I am an ordinary man, but I dare to stain myself with blood. Please. The Yen Emperor did not speak. The clean man sitting next to him stood up and tore off a piece of his sleeve. The mountains around Deer Mountain were deathly silent. The air seemed to have been frozen and could not move. There was no sound of wind in the mountains. Li Kaitian was arrogant by nature. Facing Feng Xiang's bow, he looked up at the sky arrogantly and said softly, "This kind of battle is a joy in life. But it is a pity that I cannot personally ask the Yuanwu Emperor for advice." Feng Xiang calmly straightened his body, looked at him, and said, "To me, you are already the best opponent, so I have no regrets. From this, I have already won." Li Kaitian shook his head. I have nothing to worry about. I bathed and purified my body. My essence, energy, and spirit are at their peak. So we're even. Feng Xiang nodded. There was a deafening boom. As he nodded, a bright ripple appeared in the air between the two and spread to the sides. While it gave off a deafening sound, the ripple was just light, and not something intangible. Thought sword art. There were countless grandmasters present, each with their own mysterious and unfathomable means. However, when they saw the bright and invisible ripples, more than half of them changed their expressions and confirmed that they were no match for the two people present. Using thought power to form a sword was for speed. But Feng Xiang's thought sword attack was close to a true flying sword. Such a method rarely appeared in records, but Li Saiqian's use of thought to form a seal was just as astounding. Please. Feng Xiang spoke and reached forward. A straight and dark sword light appeared in his hand and stabbed at Li Kaitian. Hearing him speak, it seemed that in his view, just now, the thought sword attack was just a test, and not a true attack. The path of the sword was ordinary, but it carried an indescribable power that could split mountains. The overly straight and sharp sword energy cut off many of the paths of the primal energies of the universe in the air, causing many of the Yen dynasty seal masters present to turn pale. In front of such a seemingly ordinary sword attack, they could not even cast a complete seal. Li Kaitian had never encountered such a sword attack. He frowned slightly, and a square seal that looked like green jade appeared at the fingertip of his left hand. With a soft puff, an extremely pure Yuan Qi gushed out from the green talisman. His body suddenly disappeared from his spot and appeared behind Feng Xiang. Uncontrollable gasps sounded. Li Saiqian's action looked simple, but under the pressure of such a sword energy, such a simple scene contained the principles of primal energies of the universe that most Realm Sevens could not understand. The sword move was straightforward, but Li Kaitian was behind it. If his attack missed, Feng Xiang would undoubtedly lose. Yet the gasps were not because of Li Kaitian, but because of Feng Xiang's attack. Feng Xiang's forward figure did not change at all. A dot of light appeared at the tip of his sword. His sword passed through this dot of light, and the blade was bathed in a layer of wondrous light. All of the sword energy in front of the blade disappeared. Behind him, countless white streams of turbulence appeared. Each stream of white turbulence was a stream of pure sword qi. The white turbulence completely covered Li Saiqian's body. Li Saiqian's expression was calm. A yellow seal paper flew out of his hand and hit the ground. All of Deer Mountain shook, slightly. Thousands of yellow dust suddenly surged out from the ground under his feet. The white turbulence and the floating yellow dust met. Time seemed to have slowed down, and the air seemed to have become heavy, as if many mountains had suddenly filled the air. Before the white turbulence and the yellow dust had any changes, Feng Xiang's body suddenly shook slightly. His face paled, and faint blood foam came out of his nostrils. This instant of confrontation actually ended with him being injured. However, at this moment, his left hand was also raised behind him. An indigo sword energy flew out of his index and middle fingers like a dragon scale. In a flash, it disappeared from everyone's perception. There was a soft sound. A sword hole appeared on Li Saiqian's left shoulder. Blood sprayed out, and the yellow dust turned blood red. Good sword. Li Saiqian's expression was grave as he looked at Feng Xiang's back. Feng Xiang turned around, looked at him, and said solemnly, "Good seal." Both of them were injured, and both of them praised the other's methods. However, the confrontation between the two of them did not stop at all. The moment Li Kaitian said, "Good sword," an enormous shadow fell from the sky. Feng Xiang's black longsword was no longer in his hand. His hands were empty. The huge shadow that fell from the sky was actually a huge sword that was as big as a mountain. This was an unimaginable scene. Not just the people present at the peak of Deer Mountain. Even the people on the other mountains around Deer Mountain could clearly see such an enormous sword. Or rather, they could clearly see an enormous dragon. Under the constant influx of yuan qi from the surroundings, the dragon scale sword grew many times larger. Every scale on the sword had turned into a huge black rock without any light. Just from this, everyone would feel that the sword had turned into countless huge rocks. But at this moment, at the tip of the sword, there were two bright yellow flames burning. The two bright yellow flames flashed with cold and ruthless emotions. A powerful presence completely different from Feng Xiang's own, a gaze that looked down on all life, fell from the two flames. This was an aura that only a certain kind of extremely powerful demon beast could possess. When beasts reached a certain level of power, they could not be described as Yao. In a long period of human history, they were only feared, worshipped, and regarded as king. Many serpents in the world had similar presences. In the space that was originally empty, where even the air seemed to have been forced away by the sword qi, there was suddenly the sound of strong air currents, and countless air currents gushed out of nowhere. A crack appeared in the sky. The cracks that spewed out countless streams of air on both sides were like a huge Dao sword that met the dragon scale sword. Just now, his attack was only broken. His current attack was the true power of his will of the heavens. Two forces that few people in the world could stop collided. Boom! A circle of chi wave and shock wave landed on the ground. All the rocks around Li Ziyan's feet were instantly turned to dust. The entire ground caved in by a few feet, and then rose into the air before disappearing by another few feet. Li Ziyan's body shook as he swallowed hard. His robes turned completely red. Bloody foam appeared on the surface of his skin from the shock, but his expression was still calm. Feng Xiang's brow furrowed so deeply that multiple cracks seemed to appear between his brows. The dragon scale, sword floating in the air, jumped up and paused for a moment. In the next moment, countless black stone-like dragon scales left the sword and started to fly outwards. Red sparks and golden sword light scattered in the air, just like the splashing of real dragon blood. Pew, 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 pew. As these dragon scales flew out, cracks suddenly appeared on the surface of Feng Xiang's body, and blood gushed out from them. He was covered in wounds and covered in blood. Many people were shocked, speechless. They could not even see the victor between the two. You have lost. Li Kaitian looked calmly at Feng Xiang. The dragon scale sword in the sky had lost all its dragon power and was falling backwards like a piece of rusted metal. I will win. Feng Xiang shook his head and walked towards Li Kaitian. A wild wind rose in front of him and then spread to the sides. Li Ziyan's expression grew serious. He understood Feng Xiang's meaning. Feng Xiang's dragon scale sword had been destroyed, but Feng Xiang himself was also a sword. Threads of blood flew out of Li Ziyan's fingertips and formed a blood seal in front of him. The blood of cultivators, especially those of Li Ziyan's level, was the best container for primal energies of the universe. As this blood seal formed, there was a boom. Countless streets seemed to appear in the air in front of Feng Xiang. There seemed to be many invisible blades in these streets that slashed towards Feng Xiang's body. The vital energy and primal energies of the universe flowing out of Feng Xiang's body moved forward and gathered on the surface of his body. His body became the sharpest sword. These invisible blades could not cut any wounds on his body, but when the blades hit his body, they seemed to become small hammers. Fine cracking sounds could be heard from his body. These were the sounds of his meridians, bones, and even marrow rivers breaking. Feng Xiang paused. his vitality started to dissipate from his body, but there was still an indescribable smile at the corners of his mouth. The Yuanwu Emperor glanced at Feng Xiang. A soft sound came from Feng Xiang's body again. All the powerful cultivators felt that many fatal blockages in Feng Xiang's body had been opened. Multiple doctors came out of the Qin dynasty's attendants and quickly sent Feng Xiang to the tent in the back. Seeing this scene, other than the Qin people, the cultivators of the other 3 dynasties felt cold and were silent. While it was a draw, Li Kaitian was likely the strongest cultivator of the Yan dynasty. While Feng Xiang was strong, he was not the strongest cultivator of the Qin dynasty. He was not even the strongest cultivator of the Qin dynasty other than the Yuanwu Emperor. So in reality, the Qin dynasty had won. General Feng is crippled. Li Kaitian is dead. Pan Rui said coldly and softly. Ding Ning looked at the peak of Deer Mountain and breathed as calmly as he could. The great energy changes caused him to sense the direction of Li Kaitian and Feng Xiang's battle. Just a dozen years had passed, but the methods of the present top grandmasters were much different from the cultivators before the Yuanwu Emperor's ascension. Change meant more unknowns and dangers. The light in Li Xiqian's eyes quickly disappeared. True death was coming, but he did not fear death. He said softly to himself, "If I still cannot kill you this time, Yuanwu Emperor, then you will not die." Li Kaitian represented the Emperor of Yan. He had attacked first and died. This meant that the Emperor of Yan's punch had been easily blocked. Looking at the silent Emperor of Yan, everyone started to wait for the Emperor of Chu or the Emperor of Qi to speak. The Emperor of Chu was deep in thought. At this time, the beautiful man in black robes next to the Emperor of Qi looked up at him. The Emperor of Chu stilled slightly. The beautiful man in black robes' expression did not change, and his gaze did not seem to show any clear emotion. But the Emperor of Chu sensed something. He looked away and looked at the Yuanwu Emperor. With this glance, everyone knew that he was about to speak. When the Son of Heaven is angry, millions will bleed. So if the Son of Heaven is easily angered, he will easily attract the wrath of the heavens. The Emperor of Chu looked at the Yuanwu Emperor and said slowly, "My dynasty's craftsmen made a seal weapon at the beginning of last year called the Heavenly Wrath. I think everyone knows." As his voice sounded, strange sounds suddenly sounded from the Chu camp in Deer Mountain as though they were responding from afar. The Yuanwu Emperor's expression did not change as he waited silently. The sound grew closer and clearer. In the perception of all the cultivators on the mountain peak, there seemed to be an enormous insect flapping its wings. Some of the people who held high positions in the imperial court had nervous looks in their eyes. The Heavenly Wrath was a kind of standard seal weapon of the Chu dynasty. Supposedly, it was far more powerful than all the standard seal weapons of the Chu dynasty. The information that had been obtained through secret channels had caused people to suspect that the Heavenly Wrath was very different from the standard seal weapons. Now that the Emperor of Chu had spoken and mentioned this item with a double meaning, people felt that this item was extraordinary. The strange vibrations passed through the clouds and came closer to the peak of Deer Mountain. At this time, on a mountain peak outside Deer Mountain, Ding Ning could not hear the sound, but he sensed something strange. He sensed that the sunlight in the sky seemed to have dimmed. The sunlight falling from the sky seemed to be attracted by something. He took a deep breath and knew that something new had appeared. Gasps sounded on the peak of Deer Mountain. Many people's gazes froze. Pieces of metal reflected light passed through the clouds, level with the peak, and then continued to rise. These were thin pieces dozens of feet long and wide. They curved slightly like flower petals. While they gave off a metallic light, they were so thin they were almost transparent. However, this kind of standard seal weapon was too shocking, and he could not bring himself to gloat over it. Ding Ning's gaze moved away from the sky and landed on Mo Shoching and Pan Rui in front of him. The Chu king's decades of waiting had come to nothing. He had not obtained the flesh Bodhi in the hidden place under Goddess Peak, but he had not gained nothing. These things clearly came from his research and changes to that formation. The Chu dynasty was indisputably the best in forging, but Ding Ning could see now that Mo Shoching and Pan Rui were not shocked. Even if they knew what kind of standard seal weapon this heavenly wrath was, they would be shocked when they saw its power with their own eyes. There was only one reason not to be shocked. He felt slightly bitter inside. Something like the heavenly punishment was a top secret in the Chu dynasty, but when it appeared for the first time at the Deer Mountain Conference, it had been suppressed by the Qin dynasty. The most likely possibility was that someone had leaked this secret to the Qin dynasty. Also, this person's status was not low. Otherwise, they could not have come into contact with the true secret of this item. Enough. At this time, the king of Chu shouted in a low voice. The air stilled, and all the voices behind him disappeared. There is no meaning. Murderousness flashed across his face. He recovered his calmness and said slowly, the craftsmen and officials behind him, who had been crying bitterly and angrily, knew that these words were spoken by their monarch to comfort them. However, the sadness in their hearts could not be hidden. Although they no longer spoke, they all lowered their heads, their bodies trembling uncontrollably. Long ago, when Chongling started the reform, and Chongling started to be rebuilt, the turrets in Chongling were not just used to observe and move troops. The king of Chu spoke as though nothing had happened. He looked at the Yuanwu emperor and slowly said, "Back then, the cultivators of the Bazin Kendo ground wanted to set up seal weapons on the turrets that could reach every corner of Chongling. If I remember correctly, the idea was called the falling moon. When the energy of a powerful enough otherworldly item is gathered by some seal crystals, it can shoot to any corner of Chongling like a powerful flying sword. Everyone who walks in Chongling has a sword hanging over their head that can appear at any time. This is the true reason why Chongling did not set up outer walls from the start. But this kind of seal weapon is too sinister. It needs countless corpses, and most of them are the corpses of cultivators and women. They need to be processed with seal water before they can be used to forge the seal weapon. Also, the Bazin Kendo ground cultivators who proposed this idea died before you ascended the throne, so the creation of this seal weapon was put aside. I had not thought that you and Zhong Xiu would find a way to forge this kind of seal weapon." As he slowly spoke, Ding Ning, who was beside Fu Su on the mountain outside, finally remembered what kind of seal weapon this was. Falling moon. He uttered these words coldly in his heart. The emperors of Qi and Yen had ugly expressions. Regardless of what kind of seal weapon this was, they could sense that the power of this light surpassed the life-bond swords of ordinary realm 6 Qi cultivators nourished with energy for many years. You are right. The Yuanwu emperor nodded directly. He looked at the emperor of Chu and said, "So there is no need to discuss the matter of Yangshan commandery." The emperor of Chu shook his head and said, "It is not so simple." When these seemingly light words were spoken, everyone at the peak of Deer Mountain shook slightly. Yangshan commandery had at least 100,000 elite soldiers of the Chu dynasty, and many of them were famous generals of the Chu dynasty. At this time, this army had likely disappeared. Adding on that even their most important standard weapons were useless, the Chu dynasty had been defeated repeatedly in the talks between Deer Mountain and the Qin dynasty. If they paid a great price, they would not just be forced to give back Yangshan commandery. The Yuanwu emperor frowned slightly. He slowly looked up, but did not look at the Emperor of Chu. His gaze landed behind the Emperor of Chu. The beautiful man in black robes next to the Emperor of Qi showed shock for the first time. A barefoot man with messy hair slowly walked out of the elegant Chu palace. This was a man whose true age could not be determined from his appearance. He wore long robes made from untanned sheepskin and had messy totems drawn on them using the simplest colored stone powder. He did not look like someone from the Chu dynasty, but a shaman from a tribe on the edge of the desert. Chapter 207. Marquis Su looked at the messy-haired man dressed as a border shaman. His thick brows unconsciously furrowed. He felt that this person was somewhat familiar, but he couldn't remember who this person was at the moment. Since you managed to escape the Han capital, you should be a shaman. Why did you come back? Emperor Yuanwu spoke at this time. His eyes were filled with faint disdain as he looked at the barefoot man with messy hair. The barefoot man sighed. I escaped for today. Marquis Su was shocked. He realized who this person was. The mountain peak was in an uproar. Just from these two sentences, everyone knew the identity of this barefoot man. This barefoot man, with messy hair, was a figure that had been recorded in the history books. He was Emperor Qin of Han. Strictly speaking, he was also an emperor. He was the younger brother of Emperor Ai of Han, and had the purest royal blood of the Han dynasty. In the past, Emperor Ai of Han had been tricked into moving the capital. In the end, the dynasty declined. When Emperor Ai of Han was about to die, he decreed that his younger brother would be emperor. This was the barefoot man with messy hair. But Emperor Qin of Han had never truly sat on the throne. When Emperor Ai of Han was dying, the Qin army had reached the city. The new Han capital, Luoyi, was in chaos. Before the Qin army could truly attack the city, it had been torn apart. In the chaos and siege of the Qin army, the legends said that Emperor Qin of Han had escaped the city on a carriage transporting feces. In the end, he escaped with his life. It was a tragic matter for a true emperor to not be on the throne, much less escape on a carriage transporting feces. In the eyes of many Han people, it was better for Emperor Qin of Han to die. When the city fell, at least this kind of thing would not be recorded and shamed in the future. For a legitimate emperor whose birth and ascension to the throne were unquestionable, it was better to die in the eyes of his people. This was the greatest pain. They were both emperors. One was despised by the people. The other was loved by the people. So the Yuanwu emperor looked at Emperor Qin of Han with faint disdain. What can you do after lingering at death's door until today? The Yuanwu emperor looked at Emperor Qin of Han and said mockingly. Emperor Qin of Han's eyes flashed with pain. This pain didn't come from his reputation or the judgment of others. Instead, it came from the people who had died, so that he could live. Only he knew how many people had died for him to escape the Handi and the pursuit of the Qin dynasty cultivators. After this trace of pain flashed through his eyes, his pupils became absolutely calm. Instead, they rippled with a trace of relief and peace. Please enlighten me. He looked at the Yuanwu emperor and said slowly. The Yuanwu emperor narrowed his eyes. The peak of Deer Mountain was deathly silent again. Only the wild wind created by the chaotic primal energies of the universe howled. The Yuanwu emperor slowly stood up. Emperor Qin of Han must have been a powerful cultivator, but first and foremost, he was a true emperor. The Yuanwu emperor would never refuse such an invitation, regardless of whether it was the ancient etiquette or the bravery of the Qin dynasty. What right do you have to fight me? The Yuanwu emperor looked at Emperor Qin of Han and said slowly. Rising meant accepting the challenge. He would accept the challenge first, and then ask if his opponent qualified to challenge him, because he feared that he was the only realmmate in the world right now. Emperor Qin of Han did not speak. His body, hair, and skin quietly turned red. Threads of red energy started to seep out of every part of his body. The presence around him started to swell. When the first thread of energy came out of his body, he gave off a realm 7 presence. As his presence rose, the presence he gave off broke through the limits of realm 7. Gasps sounded uncontrollably. The faint disdain in the Yuanwu Emperor's eyes completely disappeared. He frowned slightly and said in a grave voice, "So it is the heaven-stealing pill. So it is the heaven-stealing pill." When the Yuanwu Emperor spoke, many people present thought the same. These people finally understood why Emperor Chen of Han had to live in the past. In the past, the strongest sect of the Han dynasty had been the South Sun Pill sect. The middle-grade pills of the South Sun Pill sect were already supreme-grade pills that could only be chanced upon by luck in the other dynasties. The heaven-stealing pill was the best pill of the South Sun Pill sect. The true meaning of heaven-stealing was to steal the realm of heaven opening. In many records, this was a great pill that could allow a Realm 7 cultivator to reach Realm 8 after ingesting and refining it. Such a heaven-defying pill naturally required the consumption of countless unimaginable and astonishing spiritual herbs. The South Sun Pill sect had been poor for many generations. Supposedly, when Emperor Ai of Han was about to die, they had just managed to gather enough main ingredients for this pill to make a medicine embryo. After the Han dynasty was destroyed, the cultivators of the other dynasties thought that such a pill did not exist, and that it was just something the South Sun Pill sect made up to scare people. But now, Emperor Chen of Han's stunning presence, like a blooming red lotus, reminded everyone present that the South Sun Pill sect's heaven-stealing pill was real. The greatest difference between pill sects and other cultivators is that they have form but not form. The Yuanwu Emperor looked at Emperor Chen of Han, whose medicinal energy had dyed the ground red. He shook his head and said, "You are still not a match for me." Emperor Chen of Han looked at the Yuanwu Emperor and suddenly laughed. He said, "This is just a battle. How can we determine victory?" The Yuanwu Emperor suddenly laughed and said, "Battle can reduce this lonely one's enemies, so this lonely one is not afraid of battle." When he said this, everyone thought that the battle would immediately start. Unexpectedly, the Yuanwu Emperor's gaze landed on the handsome black-robed man next to the Qi Emperor. "Earlier, when we were climbing the mountain, I saw a thread of your energy. Only the Mountainine sect has such methods. Mr.'s presence, you must be Mr. Yen-ing of the Mountainine sect." The Yuanwu Emperor's voice was calm, but he called Mr. Since the start of the conference, no one had seen him be so respectful to someone. The name Yen-ing of the Mountainine sect was not famous in the world. Even though many people present were top figures in the world, many had not heard of him. Who is he? A Yen general could not help but ask a shocked middle-aged official in front of him. The shocked middle-aged official was the famous minister of the Yen dynasty, Qiu Yuzhen. The one who asked him was the famous general of the Yen dynasty, Li Han. In the past, General Baiyong of my dynasty fought the Qi army. He was about to win, but in the end, he retreated because someone delivered a black jar. Qiu Yuzhen turned his head and said softly to Li Han. Li Hanshan's body suddenly shook. His eyes filled with shock. Was the person who delivered the jar that day this Yen-ing? Qiu Yuzhen smiled bitterly. Who else could it be but this Yen-ing? Before there was a formal agreement, it was common for the dynasties to clash and invade each other's cities. In the past, the Yen dynasty had a conflict with the Qi army because of several deserters, resulting in a great war. At the time, the strongest general of the Yen dynasty, Baiyong, won 3 battles and took 3 Qi cities. He forced the main force of the Qi army to the Qi Guima River, unable to transport enough food. The The Qi army was about to be defeated or forced to cede cities. Yet, at this time, a Qi grandmaster delivered a black jar to Bai Yong. Bai Yong opened the jar. There was nothing inside. He felt that there was great mystery inside. After thinking hard for half a day, he finally found that there was no mystery in the jar. The true mystery was in the black jar itself. This seemingly ordinary black jar was actually formed from extremely pure, true essence. Condensing vital energy into an object and not dissipating was already an astounding method. To be able to hide from the senses of a Realm 7 expert like Bai Yong and make him study for half a day before seeing the secret, this kind of realm was not something an ordinary Realm 7 Grandmaster could imagine.